You'd think I'd get better at this over time. Starting to think maybe it's something I should practice on the regular when I'm not doing the extra live stream. Alas, no luck. Howdy, viewer. I see you out there. Bear with me. I'm still getting things set up ahead of our scheduled 7, 8 p.m. start time. I suppose if I was a professional, I'd have had this done already, but, I'm not. Hey, man. Boy, do I have a story to tell you about this year. Holy cow. Hey, there's the setting I was looking for to get that centered up properly. There it is. Well, I don't know how many streamers you're going to watch in the next year or so, but I don't figure there's too many of them who can say, I survived brain surgery 2 months before I committed to a 38-day string of Dwarf Fortress streams. Telling people I've had steel tools inside my skull and they left behind a piece of nonstick cookware somehow doesn't quite carry the full majesty of it, I guess. I'm just happy to finally have had a surgery that finally worked. Welcome aboard, Hectic Hermit. We're going to go live in about 15 minutes from now. The traction bench. So I'm going to assume nobody in chat is familiar with the Janetta procedure because I know I wasn't before I had to be. It's about as minimally invasive as you can get and still call it brain surgery, I guess. Um, I probably should throw up a blurb in the about section for those folks who are interested, just as a morbid curiosity sort of thing, I suppose. But no, they actually, I was back at my PC doing minimal activity sorts of things about 3 days after the surgery, and I was back to work 10 days after they were done. since I don't work lifting and moving heavy objects, it was safe. I've got a great big zipper scar up the side of my head behind one ear, and I am the only member of my family I know of to have undergone brain surgery now. So, claim to fame, I suppose. So, level with me. How's the voice audio? I think I've got it set right, but it's difficult for me to tell from an outsider's perspective. I know I don't have sound sense running yet. I suppose I can get that up.
Early and we still had feels for what could be our own ends. I like that. I like
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Wait, who said what about just people with just meat? What? Oh, just people with just meat? What?
Hey, Valdemar, welcome back, boss. How's it been? Hey, Valdemar, welcome back, boss. Right? I mean, you'd think I'd be more prepared or something, right? Like actually ready to do it this year. After having an entire year to prepare and stuff. But no, as usual, October 1st rolls around and I realize I haven't posted an advertisement at the Dwarf Fortress subreddit and I haven't let everybody know I'm going to do it. Hey, it's 2020, it's the coming year. I'm here. See? Now, in my defense, Valdemar, I underwent cranial surgery in the middle tail end of August, so I've I've only been off the surgeon's table now for just a hair over a month. Yeah, if you're curious, I can fill you in all the details, but I don't want my whole stream to be about my brain surgery, so we won't talk about it too much once we get underway. I really did want to stream more in 2019 and the first part of 2020, if you can believe it, but my health issues have prevented me. And that's not an excuse. Oh, damn, man, brain tumors are no fun. I lost a friend of mine to glioblastoma. One minute he's fine, and 2 weeks later they're hauling him in. He's so riddled with it that they can't do anything for him. That sucks. I hope your friend's doing all right, man. Yeah, I mean, like one day he's there, we're talking games. What's new? What have you played? What's good, exciting? And he was a little tired and kind of out of sorts. Didn't come into work the next day, or at least I thought he did. And come to find out, he'd actually showed up, and ooh, that's rough. Yeah, no, I mean, literally, he was there on a Wednesday, came back and checked on him on a Friday, and apparently he had come into work, sat down, started working, and somebody asked him a question, and he looked at him and answered the question, and it was just total uh, aphasia. I mean, he said something, and they were English words, but in no way were they an English sentence of any sort. Radish's shoe actualized bicycle fins greenly, that kind of thing. And they straight up called the ambulance and had him taken, and uh, yeah, I mean that's the last time I saw him. I mean he was just gone, poof. Yeah, I mean I'm happy that my diagnosis was not one of cancer. That's not something I want to deal with. I've had it in my family, and I don't really want to put my wife front and center for that kind of shit show. Is not any good. Still a few people trickling in ahead of our start time. That's good. Good stuff. Don't hesitate to join chat, guys. Love to talk to the viewers and let them know what I'm doing and why. We're not planning to start until 7 p.m. That's in about 5 minutes. If you want to take a moment and grab a soda and visit the little miner's room, now's your chance. Kiss your wife if you can find her under the beard. So the plan as of right now is we're going to do a 38-day stretch of streams every single day. I'll be here playing Dwarf Fortress. Now I can't promise it'll be at the same time. Unfortunately, contrary to a lot of folks, I'm not really a professional streamer. I just do this for charity once a year. So my streams aren't always necessarily at the same time. You'll want to check the schedule before you assume that I'll be here tomorrow evening, for example, for the same time. Tomorrow, for example, we're going to do a short stream because I have something I have to take care of Friday night. And then Saturday we'll do a longer stream, but it's time shifted. And I think Sunday we'll probably be back on the regular schedule, if you will. But the plan is we'll do 38 days straight for our charity event for Extra Life, where I'll teach players how to play Dwarf Fortress like you've just joined, basically. You want to know how this game works. That's the idea. All right. So let's get this show on the road. So for those of you who've never seen it before, this is the startup panel for the what used to be called the Lazy Noob Pack and is now the Dwarf Fortress Collection Extraordinaire, if you will. It's got everything in it. This will allow you to set various settings for Dwarf Fortress at the push of a button for things that are commonly changed by a wide variety of users. But by and large, it is really only a front end for a few data files in the Dwarf Fortress folder. In particular, there's a couple of init files, and I'll go into those probably in a later stream when I'll walk back through this. But they'll allow you to set the population cap or the child cap. All of these settings are taken directly from those files, and you can modify your game to a limited degree without having to pop open a text editor and go to town, just by being able to change these. Now, I think some of these by default are a little different than what I've set them to. Depending on your PC and what you have in terms of hardware, you may get away with fewer or greater number of population and visitors. You'll kind of have to judge that for yourself as you've gone along. If you have too many, what will effectively happen is your fortress will eventually crawl to a halt. It'll take days to do anything simply because your dwarves and the simulation will be running so slow. We probably won't run a fortress long enough for that to be an issue, and we won't run our population cap up high enough for it to become a problem. Now, a few of these other things are worth mentioning here because I leave them on, but they can affect frame rates. Weather affects frame rates. Temperature affects frame rates. If you're having troubles getting Dwarf Fortress to run smoothly at all on perhaps a really low end machine, then you may want to disable those. However, Dwarf Fortress prides itself on its simulation, so everything you're disabling, anything you disable, potentially removes an aspect of Dwarf Fortress that is there intentionally. So, for example, removing temperature sounds good at first because it speeds up your simulation, but it also prevents magma from burning things. So that's not necessarily a good thing if you plan to use a magma trap. Likewise, disabling weather sounds good, but some dwarves like weather effects, or you might want to embark somewhere where there's a particular type of weather effect, and if you disable them globally, you don't get things like rains and such. Lazy Noob is still the standard. I say that I say that it's not. It's technically the starter pack now. I think they've kept the logo up here at the top, but that's about it. There's a version for Mac. There's a version for uh, Linux. I use Windows, so this is the Windows version we're looking at. I can't really advise you on the Mac or the Linux versions. They shouldn't differ too much. Like I said, I don't have a Mac. I don't have a Linux box. I don't run any other operating system to play Dwarf Fortress on. So all I know is this pack. That's it, the starter pack. So, oh, I guess it's probably baked into the compiled executable, isn't it? That's a pity. You convince him to use an external logo of the same size. Convince him to dynamically load an external logo file at startup, uh, Clinadev, and then just switch the logo on him and don't tell him. Um, you heard it here first. That's the plan. Go for it. So, where was I? Oh yeah. So yeah, this is kind of the standard. Again, I can't advise you on the Mac or the Linux packs. They're going to operate in very similar fashion, but beyond that, I don't know how similar. They'll let you change things like what your graphics tile set is if you want to play with a different version of graphics. By default, Dwarf Fortress is going to use ASCII letters and numbers to represent and symbols to represent characters and NPCs in your world. Um, you can change that, and in fact, for new players, I really kind of recommend that you do, at least to start. If you want to go back and learn Dwarf Fortress with the ASCII as a purist would learn it, that's an admirable, laudable goal. But frankly, it drives me bonkers to try. I've made several attempts, and I'm just not willing to focus on letters that move around that much. I think it. I think it takes my mild dyslexia and throws it for an absolute fit. Um, but I love the tile sets. Originally, when I first started streaming, I used the Phoebus tile set. It's simple, it's clean, it's very easy to understand what's going on. If you've been playing video games in the modern era, so uh, if you've been playing video games in the modern era, you're used to identifying things by symbols. And while letters are symbols in that sense, I find that the graphic tile set makes the game easier to understand at a glance, especially for new players who may have an inkling just from the image of what they're looking at. Whereas every letter on the screen would have to be individually and painstakingly inspected to understand what exactly you're looking at. Is that G a goblin or a great? A new player's not going to know. Um, whereas with the images, they're going to be substantially different. Now, which tile set you use, that's going to be completely up to you. I have heard impassioned pleas and arguments for every tile set in this list, uh, right down and including the one that we're going to use tonight, which I'm still stuck on the Vetlinger tile set because that's what I had last time. I like Vetlinger. I just don't have a big enough monitor to really take advantage of it. It's a 32x tile set. And the problem is that it tends to make things at my preferred level of zoom. It tends to make things a little small for me. I'm getting old and my eyesight's just not that good anymore. If I had a really big monitor, 32x tile set would be a must. Uh, you'd be better off to ask Clinadev than me about the Steam version. I've been watching their releases, but I haven't been following them as closely, and there's not one yet. There's not a Steam version yet. But if you go out on Steam and you search for Dwarf Fortress, you will in fact find a effectively a placeholder store page for the what they're calling, I think they're calling it the premium version or whatever. Everything you know and love about Dwarf Fortress will continue to be free or for donation. They're not changing that. It's not like the game is suddenly going for pay and all future versions are going to be paid through Steam or anything. It's nothing like that. But they're including some preloaded graphics tile sets and similar things in the Steam version. And you're effectively paying a small fee to have that stuff all set up for you and delivered automatically. I've got my fingers crossed. I'm hoping it has a really good launch. I want Dwarf Fortress to hit the kind of for folks who let me back up a step. I guess for folks who like management games in general, if you've played RimWorld or Oxygen Not Included or uh, another modern management or even RTS game that you might think of, for me, Dwarf Fortress kind of sits back at those and says, okay, here's an old school NetHack style implementation of those same games. So tonight we'll use the Vetlinger tile set. To get back to what we're doing here. Now I'll go back through the utilities here in a second. Dwarf Fortress, everything I do tonight, no matter how I do it, except for the stuff that involves DF hack, which I'll get to in a minute, can be done through the native interface. You can use your keyboard and Dwarf Fortress and nothing else to play the game. It is doable. However, um, I've been gaming for 35 years. And frankly, I don't need any more clicking or button pressing than I absolutely have to. And a few of these utilities can be used to greatly streamline or simplify your necessary inputs, not in the sense that you're cheating, but in the sense that rather than going through the tedious and cumbersome menus that are shipped with the game, which are placeholders for eventual replacement, you can simply work around that using a third party utility. We'll be using Dwarf Therapist extensively once we get underway to change dwarven labors, set dwarves up to do various tasks, view our dwarves in general. That can all be done directly through Dwarf Fortress, but it involves a lot of going into and out of menus, and the presentation is, well, placeholder. So we're not going to. Frankly, I don't need carpal tunnel syndrome. I work on a keyboard enough as it is. SoundSense will use to provide audio feedback. For those of you who've played old school NetHack style games like Moria or Angband or NetHack itself, a lot of those by default out of the box are silent. And for a relatively modern gamer like me, who goes back to when consoles had saucy wood paneling, games have always had sound feedback for the most part. I can play Zork, I suppose, but I'd prefer to have a bit of a music with it behind it if I can. Additionally, a lot of the activity that goes on in Dwarf Fortress uh, is shown in announcements. Such and so is sparring with this other dwarf. This person just had a baby. Sound cues will allow us to keep track of lots and lots of those events occurring at once, up to a certain limit, without having to check the announcements page routinely and constantly just to see what's going on minute by minute in our fortress. Now, it can get a little annoying. Some folks have commented in the past that, especially once the dwarves get to sparring, all you kind of hear is the clang and clatter of dwarves sparring. But I'm okay with that. Repetitive sound doesn't necessarily bother me. If it starts to be annoying, let me know, guys, and we'll see about maybe disabling it at some point. So, advanced settings aren't really all that advanced. The game's in game music, I turn it off because SoundSense will provide music for us. It's a lovely strumming thing, but it does get a little repetitive after your first few hundred hours playing. Um, you can turn an FPS counter on to see how your game is progressing in terms of frame rate. We talked earlier about if you have too many dwarves and too many things going on in your game, the game can actually slow to a dead halt. The FPS counter will let you monitor that. Uh, it just may or may not be useful to you. I'm not going to worry about it for now. We're probably not going to run this first fort long enough for it to matter. FPS caps. This I'm not going to mess with. The gist is that this determines how fast Dwarf Fortress will be allowed to run at a maximum. And what this says is it will calculate twice as many frames as it shows us at maximum, meaning that it's doing a little calculation that's not necessarily reflected instantly in the graphics. You can change those, but before you do, I highly recommend digging deeper into what they actually mean. You're going to need to get into there pretty deep. Now, resolution is if you're playing in tiles, it's the default screen resolution for your ASCII characters. Save related is a big category I like to hit for new players. You won't need to mess with this unless you're playing in ASCII. It's to allow you to display greater than or less than your telnet window effectively. Your actual session window might not have 80 by 25. It might be 144 by 25 if you had a different ASCII layout. Back before back before monitors were 16 by 9 format. Save related. I turn on seasonal auto saves. You can do yearly if you want it to do it less often, but I prefer to have backups more often. Dwarf Fortress is still, no matter how you slice it, a work in development, and probably will always be. But sometimes it can be more in development than others, and spacing your saves too far apart makes it more difficult for you to recover where you were if you should lose progress due to an unfortunate bug or unforeseen incident. So I recommend turning on seasonal autosaves. You can turn on pause on save if, for example, saving takes a long time on your machine. You might want to turn the pause on so you can go get up, go grab a soda, and use the bathroom while the save runs. Then when you come back, no time has progressed since the end. I like to back up the saves, meaning rather than using one save over and over again for my autosave, it will actually back them up seasonally for me. That allows me to revert to various points in the fortress's history if I want to replay something or see how something might have done differently if I had only acted in this way. Sometimes an seasonal autosave will allow you to get there. I do an initial save when we first arrive because I want to be able to revert back to a clean embark on that same site if I like it. Maybe I found a volcano site that I really like with a waterfall that just flows just right for this fortress I have in mind. And then I play it and I screw it up and I want to start it over. Well, if I have an initial save, I can reload back to where I was when I first embarked on the site. It won't necessarily be the same fort because the history may be a bit different, but it will be the same site. Pause on load keeps the game from immediately starting to play as soon as it arrives. That's to allow my poor old man reflexes to keep up. And compressed saves is generally something I would keep on. You can turn it off. Your saves will get much larger, and they're already fairly big as it is. Um, but there's not really a reason to turn it off unless you're having problems with saving. And I can honestly tell you that in most versions, you're not going to. I can honestly tell you I don't remember the last time I had a problem that would have been fixed by turning off compression. You can use the link here to get directly to your save game folder. So, for example, here are my save games that I had already loaded up from where I was messing around with the game the other day. You can use that to move saves back. Here is an example of what I meant when I said I keep regional saves, or I keep an initial save and a seasonal backup. This is my current save for that region, and this is my save for the first day you get to play, which is the 15th of January. I even made myself a backup of it. I turn off the warnings for damp stone and warm stone. It's not so much that I don't want to know about these things so much as it is if I start digging around water or magma, these announcements stop being useful and start being really, really annoying. By default, they will pause the game and recenter your screen on the event in question to call your attention to it. The problem with that is that when it does that, let's say you're digging under a river, there's 3 dozen or 4 dozen squares of water, damp water logged stone that you're going to be digging around. You're going to get an announcement for every time somebody discovers one of them. And it's going to pause the game and recenter the screen on you. And then you're going to unpause the game and go back to what you were doing. And then half a second later, it's going to pause on you again and recenter back to the new section of damp stone that they've discovered. We're going to know I'm going to explain at that point when we get to what damp stone is, how damp stone and warm stone are important. And if these announcements become important, we'll re-enable them. But for now, we're going to leave them off. Processor priority is only going to be of real particular relevance to you if you're playing on a single uh, core box. If you're playing on a modern multi-core machine, you might as well crank it up to real time. Dwarf Fortress only uses one core. It's built as a single threaded process. It can't use all your fancy modern cores. It can't use all mine either. But you might as well give it all the core it can. So we're going to feed it as much processor priority as it can take. Now we can compress and sort files, export. We haven't done that yet, so we're going to skip on to Legends mode in a second. Now, DF Hack, the only thing I'm going to turn on by default is the multi-level view. That allows us to see more than one level of the game at a time. So if we're up at the top of a mountain, we don't just see the level of the mountain we're looking at, we also see the mountain side slowly descending away into the distance on our screen. And we can actually track creatures as they move from level to level. So that would allow us, for example, to be at the top of a mountain and see creatures walking up the sides of it. Whereas normally in Dwarf Fortress, you only see one Z level at a time, like a stack of pancakes where you can only view one pancake at a time. Our multi-level view will allow us to see the entire stack, as long as they're not obstructing one another. So let's go back to utilities for a moment. We talked briefly about Dwarf Therapist. We're going to use this heavily, and I'm going to have to explain it in great depth, to explain how I use it. And Sound Sense. There are a few others here that deserve mention. These Legends browser and Legends viewer are used to view Legends files, and I'll explain those in a minute. But the gist is that's the history of your world exported for you. So you want to know how many dwarven necromancers there are in the world. Your Legends file for that world will be able to tell you because it keeps count of that sort of thing. ISO world, I believe, allows you to create maps or create an isometric world map from your exported maps. Dwarf Portrait and Dwarf Portrait allows you to see images of the dwarves you have from their descriptions. Several of those others are worth looking at. Armok Vision allows you to pull up your fortress in a real-time 3D display and have your fortress running in 3D. Now, I haven't messed with it much, but that's the gist. I've seen the screenshots. They're impressive. I haven't got too far into most of these utilities simply because there is a large number of them, and Dwarf Fortress changes fast enough that I have enough of a time keeping up with it without digging into all of the external utilities that you can use. We will probably use Quick Fort briefly at one point, but I'll show you how to record and play back macros in Dwarf Fortress so that we don't necessarily have to depend on Quick Fort entirely. Quick Fort is nice if you want to do a really complex design, though. It will let you lay out a really complex fractal bedroom design, with the press of a button or two, so that you're not spending days and days laying out a design only to find out that you chunked out the wall in just the wrong place. So, wow, that covers a whole lot of stuff, doesn't it? So let's go back here to, is it under advanced that it pulls these up? I thought there was a way to open them directly. Okay, well, we'll pull up the Dwarf Fortress folder and we'll go into the data for a moment. Earlier, I was talking about your game being set up in init files, the options for the game being in these inits, and dinit and init are the two big ones that we'll touch on first. Announcements is where the announcements like the Dampstone and Warmstone announcement are stored. We'll get back to that later. But dinit and init represent the entire contents of your options for Dwarf Fortress. Here's the temperature and whether we have it enabled. Here's the economy. Do we allow invaders to visit our site? Will stuff cave in if we cut away all its support? All of these things are there, including some that you probably shouldn't touch, like uh, whether zero rent matters and so forth. Dig into these things before you tweak them too much. One thing I like to change, I like to turn off coffins for pets by default. If I want to bury a special dog who gave its life valiantly for the fortress, that dog is special and he goes in a coffin. All the rest of the dogs were just mangy fortress mutts and they go in the refuse pile. You can change the color if you're messing around with the ASCII. This will change the color of wounded body parts. You can uh, change the tiles for tracks, which ASCII character represents which track piece, on and on and on and on. This allows you to literally change how your game is entirely displayed at the level of the ASCII characters themselves. All of this stuff can be configured directly, and there is a large amount of it, more than I'm going to get into tonight. Likewise, the init file here covers other initialization options beyond the ones we covered, like whether you're having graphics, and if you do, what kind of graphics tile set you're using. Print mode text will be text is necessary for our multi-level display. That can cause problems in some Dwarf Fortress versions when they're relatively new, so keep an eye on it. You may have to switch back to one of the others to prevent that and give up on the multi-level display if you're running a new version of Dwarf Fortress when one comes out. We'll be using version 4704 tonight. All of these things can be configured, and there's a vast variety of what you can tweak. Dwarf Fortress is a remarkably customizable game. So let's talk about how customizable I mean for just a moment. Outside the init file, you're going to find the raws, which are the game's literal interactions, creatures, everything in the game is defined in these files, and they can be tweaked. You can have dwarves made out of wagon wood if you want, or create a new piece of armor and only humans forge it. Set up new uh, pieces of the dwarven language if you want to modify it. All the dwarven language parts you see in the game are defined in this one file. It used to be the case that we would open up some of these, the stone layer uh, in it, among others, the stone layer raw, among others, and we would disable aquifers. We're not going to disable aquifers anymore. I don't do that anymore, and I don't even recommend it for new players. If you're having trouble with your aquifer, sure, by all means, go turn it off. That's fine. Start a game without them and run them for a bit. But I'm going to show you probably at some point, if not tonight, then at least in one of the future streams, how to deal with the standard aquifer, which is a light aquifer. They don't tend to gush so much as they tend to leak or dribble, which makes them much easier to deal with for a new player. I do strongly recommend that new players avoid heavy aquifers. We'll get into that in a bit. But for the most part, you shouldn't need to mess with this stuff too much. By the time you're editing your raws, you're going to know what you're doing with them. But as an example, let's open up the stone layer raw and just take a look through it for a moment. These tags, these bracket things, define everything in the game. Sandstone has a melting point of 12,070, 12,070. I believe that's Celsius or Kelvin, but it's converted to Eurist for Dwarf Fortress's purposes. It tells you whether this can tell you whether stone is magma safe. If its boiling and melting points are high enough, like for example dolomite. Shout out to Futurama, everybody. Dolomite has a boiling point and a melting point that just won't quit, and it's safe from magma. So you can make things out of it, and if they accidentally get exposed, they won't be harmed. Everything, right, is defined in this. Items like your armor and weapons are all defined in here. Here's all the different types of gloves in the game. Gauntlets, gloves, mittens. There's only 3, that's it. But if you wanted to make another one and call them Doom Fists, this is where you would add it. Now keep in mind, you can't change the raws for your world on the fly. You'll need to change them and then generate the world. It's all baked in together when you create a world. But I encourage players, once they have some familiarity, to go out and play with those. We won't tonight. That's kind of an advanced topic. Let's get to the game, shall we? It's only been almost half an hour now, right? DK, you're going to have to help the old man out here. What was quick? The half an hour explanation of Dwarf Fortress and It's in a nutshell? That was only quick because we're skipping over it. One of these times, as old as I am, I'm probably going to have to go out and listen to them. And this is where the audience displays shock. Go ahead, emoji your shock up, kids. I'm not much of a music guy. And I've never been in a cover band. The only instrument I play is the nose harmonica. Yeah, you should be able to link. Go ahead. Do me a favor, though, if just a heads up to you folks who are thinking you'll drop in here and dump a link you shouldn't. If I find out a link is naughty, you're not just getting a ban, you're getting reported. I think I could probably trust Klinadev, though. He's only been, tagging along for the last few years of doing this. So tonight we'll design a world from scratch using our advanced parameters. Now, we're not going to tamp down on the randomization of our world too much. If you're looking for a very specific world, I encourage you to look into Perfect World, one of the utilities that ships with the starter pack. Perfect World allows you to very precisely dictate how your world will look. You can provide your own noise maps, you can lay out your volcanoes, everything right down to the end. If you want to define your world that tightly, by all means, go for it. Tonight, we'll just be using the advanced parameters to configure our world within certain limits and bounds, and then we'll just see what random fate gets us. All right. Now, I don't want to build too large of a world because the larger the world is, the more Dwarf Fortress has to keep track of, and the slower it will run overall. Now, not initially. You won't notice the difference between a large region and a small region or a pocket region initially. It's only once you've got a few thousand years of history and there's thousands of things being simulated in the background every season, all these other forts that you're not playing that are invading one another, for example. A large world has a lot more of those, especially as history runs on. Um, I encourage you to keep it within limits for now. Dwarf Fortress's scope is far greater than probably what your machine will be able to provide. I've run large regions, and if you keep the history short and start them, they're not much different than small regions in reality. There's only a small number of dwarves in the world. They're not all out there doing things at the same time. It's not really a big problem. As your history runs longer and longer, larger worlds, more things, more people, more stuff, slower world. Today we're going to modify this existing custom thing I had out here. So we're going to configure him. I'm going to leave the seed text random for now. Embark points are the points you use to purchase goods and dwarven skills at the start. If you're a new player and you just want to screw with the game and see what's possible, set this thing at 10,000. Knock yourself out. Take all the points. But bring 14 battle axes and an iron spear to start. That's not how the game is really meant to be played. But if you're experimenting or just messing around, setting your embark points lets you configure stuff so you can mess with various game systems right out of the gate. Bring enough seeds and equipment that you can immediately farm stuff. Oh, right on, man. Tarn knows who you are. That's a good start, right? Good on you, mate. End year will be the point where our sorry, back to embark points. Embark points allowed me when I first started playing to embark with enough stuff to build a metal smithing industry right on the surface because I wanted to know how you smelted metals. It allowed me to sit down and experiment with farms when I was trying to figure out how to feed my dwarves before I knew how to play the game. If you're just experimenting, experiment. Set the points up, go nuts. If you want to bring large quantities of arms and armor and set up a militia in day one, you're not going to be able to do that with the default number of points. It's just not intended for that. So set up 10,000. Bring full sets of armor for all your dwarves and practice setting up a militia. That's what this is there for. End year is when your history will stop automatically no matter what. By default, I think this is the year 1050. That's a fairly long history, especially if you've got a lot of things going on. And the longer your history runs, the fewer places will be available for you to settle in, simply because the other civilizations will expand outward and take territory. And as they do, you don't. Population cap after Civ creation and site cap after Civ creation cap down on those NPC civs a bit so that they're not too large right out of the gate. Percentage beasts dead to check for stoppage. This one deserves a bit of explanation because it's a really arcane description. In your world, there are super powerful, mega awesome beasts. These things rampage through the world pretty much wherever and however they like. But heroic dwarves, elves, humans, and occasionally goblins and kobolds will go out and kill them. Now, if you want to encounter these things in your fortress, you got to have some of them left. And this says once we hit 80% of those created beasts dead, and I don't mean animals here, I mean misshapen monstrosities of forgotten creation. Once 80% of those are dead, we start checking for whether we should stop or not. We don't start checking until the year 50, and at 80% of them dead, we will stop. So this prevents them all from being killed off before we show up on the scene. We won't worry about it until the year 50. So technically, it's possible if they all get killed off really quick, they could all be dead. But if they all get killed off that quickly, they probably weren't worth worrying about. Cull unimportant historical figures. This basically streamlines your dwarven history once it's created. Anybody who didn't do anything in their life, didn't produce offspring, did nothing major of any importance, they'd basically just get whittled down to a name and a description somewhere, and that's all you're going to find out about them. Reveal all historical events allows you to is whether or not all historical things are known when the game starts. I like to have that on, especially if I'm running a short history, because it gives you interesting things to put on your walls. If nobody knows history, it's tough to put all the historical events out there. Then we get to a whole mess of things about minimums and maximums and variances. And now we need to have a moment to talk about biomes. Biomes in Dwarf Fortress are actually determined by these results. When the world is generated, every point in the world has an elevation, an expected average rainfall, a minimum or a temperature rating, if you will, that it will normally be at on average. Drainage will tell us how often or how much water wicks away from the surface, and on and on and on. What these do is determine what biomes will be present in the world and where they'll be laid out. For today's game, we're going to set minimum elevation up a little bit from the default, and I'm doing that to kind of whittle down on some of the oceans. Terrain that's too low is ocean, terrain that's really high is a mountain. Fairly obvious, right? Mountains have to exist, or you don't have dwarves. Not so obvious. If you don't have any mountains in your map, you can't spawn any dwarven civilizations, and no dwarven civilizations means you can't play Dwarf Fortress. It's not going to work out for you.
So we have to make sure our maximum elevation is allowed. Well, that leads to variances. Okay, we've got our minimum, so we up a little bit so we have less ocean. We've got our maximum all the way up at the top. What do the variances do? Well, every time Dwarf Fortress moves left, right, up, or down as it's drawing the map, it's going to re-roll the elevation for that point. The variances determine how far from its current point, from where it was, it's allowed to vary. This is to prevent you from getting a mountain directly adjacent to the Marianas Trench. You don't want that. It's not realistic. It's not natural. So you can cap the variation, you can cap the variance so that your terrain is smoother overall. Now I'm going to leave it as is for now. I don't mind having a mountain next to a valley, for example. But if you wanted to have a smoother, more gradated terrain, you're going to need to clamp down on these a bit. Minimum rainfall by default is set to 0. That's Balderdash. There is no place on Earth, no place on Earth or any other inhabitable realistic planet that's not going to get some precipitation at some point. 0 means 0. So I've set this to 1. Even Antarctica gets snow. Even the Gobi Desert occasionally gets a light misting. It's not frequent. I wouldn't rely on it to survive, but it's there. Likewise, variance determines whether I can have a mountain or a desert next to a swamp in terms of rainfall. And I'm going to allow it because I'm not really worried about the terrain of my world being realistic so much as I am worried about having the terrain I want to be available be available. Minimum and maximum temperature determine how much of your world is frozen or scorching. If you want deserts and you want them to be hot like deserts, then you're going to need to make sure that your temperature variances are set accordingly. Drainage, I normally don't mess with. Maximum drainage is necessary for obsidian and similar stones. Minimum drainage is necessary for flux and certain sedimentary stones to exist. So if I change this, I'm actually going to change what stones are available in the world, and I don't want to mess with that. The variances still work like before. It's the minimum and maximum amount of change. So this could literally change 101 units, or literally from 0 to 100, with one step. Volcanism, like drainage, I don't mess with this. You got to have 0 to have flux. You got to have 100 to have volcanoes. You want to have both, so leave it alone normally. Savagery by default is 0 to 100. I turn my low savagery up a little bit because I want to cut down on the amount of low savage terrain. I like to embark in terrain with at least a little bit of savagery. I don't necessarily need giant animals and animal men, but I like to have something going on besides nothing. And low savagery areas tend to be really banal. So we're going to leave ours up at 10 and we'll see about embarking somewhere. Excuse me. Somewhere with a little more action. Mesh sizes are the size of the brush we use when we're laying out our world. A 2x2 brush is small. And these weighted ranges determine how much of each terrain type we would see of these types that we've just been limiting. Okay? So our minimum elevation is 30 and our maximum elevation is 400. And this next section corresponds to what percentage range of that range you'll see. So, for example, 0 to 20 is the lowest end of that range. How much terrain are we going to see in the low 20% of our maximum and minimum? How much will we see in the second fifth, in the third quintile, in the fourth quintile, in the fifth quintile, and so on? If you want to have lots and lots of mountains, you're going to need to turn the weighted range up on the high end of your elevation because you want to encourage that terrain. We're encouraging primarily mid-range terrain, mid-elevation terrain. Elevation I'm not too worried about so long as it's not a mountain and it's not an ocean. I can probably deal with it. I have to have some mountains. You can't set this to 0 because if you set it to 0, you don't have any mountains. We have to have mountains for dwarves. Likewise, rain mesh, I'm only worried about the extremes. We either have a lot of rain or we have a little rain. As long as there's something like that, I'm going to get forests and swamps at the high end, and I'm going to get deserts and pebble deserts at the lowland, badlands. I want to have these other terrains available, these other ranges available, because that's how you get shrublands and hills and grasslands, and there'll be some of that available no matter what. but I want to emphasize the terrains I like to play in, which are primarily I want to play in a desert because I want to do something with sand everywhere, or I want to play in a swamp because I want to have access to rainfalls and aquifers, for example. Drainage again, we won't mess with. We leave some of this transitional stuff, but again, I'm going minimum and maximum here to encourage the types of terrains that I like. Savagery, there's a lot of low savagery so that we get humans and elves who have places to spawn, and then there's a lot of really high savagery area which will give me places to embark into. Temperature mesh, I ignore. I don't care about temperature. It's either freezing or it's not, and I like to leave that to latitude, so I'm not too much worried about switching up and worrying about the brushes here. I ignore it. Volcanism. I want to have lots of flux-stone and I want to have lots of volcanoes. I have a pole at both the north and the south end of my world. You can change this to have no poles or only one pole. I'm trying for a somewhat realistic world in that sense. Mountain peaks. These next few minimums need a little discussion in terms of how they work. Mountain peaks are areas with the highest available elevation, 400. If you don't have any, you don't have peaks. If you don't have peaks, it can be hard to get other things as well. You don't need a huge number, and if you set this too high, your worlds will get rejected because you couldn't put enough mountain peaks in them. It doesn't matter that the 90% of the world was mountain, there wasn't enough mountain peaks. That can get your world rejected. Partial edge oceans are exactly like you would imagine. If you've ever seen a map of Middle Earth, there's an ocean that runs down the left edge, and the southern border is kind of left, well, undrawn, really, for the most part. It just sort of goes down there and tapers off somewhere. That's a partial edge. It's just part of that one edge's ocean. A complete edge ocean is one that runs the entirety of the edge. So if you imagine your square map, the entire left edge would be ocean, or the entire north edge would be ocean. Partial edge oceans only cover part of that edge. Minimum volcano number. Just like with mountain peaks, this can cause your world to be rejected if you demand too many. If I demand 400 minimum volcanoes, and the terrain doesn't support that many, it's going to reject every world I ever create simply because it can't place all the volcanoes I asked for. It's good to ask for a certain number. It's not good to ask for too many. Mineral scarcity. I honestly forget what the default is. I want to say it's 1500. I've got this set down high, or set low, so I can get lots of minerals. So I'll have plenty of sites to display for you guys on stream. But if you want to embark in a mineral poor area so that you can depend on imports, whether they be goblin armies having their equipment melted down or elves having their equipment confiscated, you can set your mineral richness for the world at that point. Uh, Too low, I've heard it starts to push out coal. So you get lots of iron, but not much coal to smelt it with. So I don't set this super low. Um, I find 750 is more than sufficient to get me plenty of sites to embark in where I can find tin, copper, and iron on the same site with flux easily without having to search through world after world. If you're looking for something a little more rough and ready where you don't have access to all the ores and you want to depend on what you can confiscate and you want to use wooden traps and stone traps, then set this higher. Make your dwarves poorer no matter where they embark, and you're going to find more of the terrain you want to embark in. Mega Beast and Semi Mega Beast and Titans, I don't mess with any of this. But the gist is, these are the caves that these things are allowed to set up in your world. How many Titans exist in your world? What your population must be before it considers Titans. So if I've created 100,000 wealth or I have 80 population, I have to start worrying about Titans showing up in my fortress. That won't take us very long, so we'll have to make sure we have some defenses up fairly reasonably. Demon types and nitrals and boogeymen and nightmares and vampires and werebeasts and blah 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 blah. Here's the gist. All these are just different types of the same basic critter. If you have 11 different types of werebeast curses, that means you have were tigers and were lions and were jaguars and were skinks and were fish and were whatever the hell else all at the same time. Um, if you set this to 1, then the only werebeasts you'll find in your world are the one type that you create. That's all this does. Uh, Different vampire curses, you could think of this as, like, yeah, were-moose. Hey, were-moose once bit my sister. And then we had to smash her under a bridge because this isn't Monty Python. Uh, Vampire curses. For those of you folks who out there who might have seen the Vampire the Masquerade and you've got all the different vampire bloodlines, this is kind of similar. This is basically where their curse originated. If you have a single source for vampirism in your world, you'll want to set that to 1. Nightmares and boogeymen are just those types of creatures that are in the world. If you're going to be an adventurer, if you're not going to play in fortress mode, you're probably going to see a lot more of the bogeyman and the night trolls. Demon types are exactly what you expect. Do you have demons made of salt and fire and ice and different things? That's what this is. Werebeast population and exported wealth requirements and Werebeast created wealth requirements work just like the Titan requirements. This prevents us from being attacked by Werebeasts until we've had a little time to prepare for them. Werebeasts, despite their common nature in modern fiction, are really, really traumatic events in Dwarf Fortress. If you're not prepared for them, they can be fortress destroying events. They're that powerful. So these settings will allow us to prevent being ambushed on day 1 by a were-jaguar that infects all 7 of our dwarves and basically ends our fortress right then and there. Secret types, regional interactions, disturbances, blah, 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 blah. Same sorts of things. These are evil rain types, can be things like powders that rain down from the sky and turn your dwarves into zombies. No, I'm not kidding. Blood rain, pus rain, all sorts of stuff. All kinds of crazy things. Clouds can make your dwarves into mindless, soulless husks and thralls that, seek to prey on the living. If you're going to embark in evil terrain, I'm not sure why you'd want to in the current version, but if you're going to, you're probably going to want to leave these things on. In the event that I might do that at some point in the 38 days, not likely, but if I do, I'll want to leave those available for me as well. Divine materials. These are sort of variants of things like iron and brass. You can have a sword made of law, or a spear made of hope. Divine materials in that sense, right? Um, these can actually be found in some cases in either in fortress mode or in adventurer mode. It's possible for your dwarven adventurers to come across a demon pit that you've uncovered in fortress mode, unearth the unholy artifacts you've entombed in your abandoned fortress, and take them off to slaughter evil elsewhere. It's doable. Divination and demonic experiments and necromancy, yada yada yada. This is basically, do these things exist in your world? For now, I wouldn't mess with any of this stuff. I'd leave it on. Come back to it later. Good counts and evil counts in subregions and wetlands and region counts, and oh my god, what is all this stuff? Well, this basically determines what types of terrain your world will have, must have, when it is first created. Before the first erosion cycle, before the rivers start to wear down the mountains, before the clouds start to unleash their rain, the moment the world is sung into being, as Tolkien would have had it, this is the type of terrain that must exist. I'm saying that at the initial start of my world, there must be 528 squares of grassland. You can look into what those regions mean, but the gist is that if these are too high or too low, that could cause your world to reject. Now, I'm not going to mess with them for now. I'm going to leave them alone. This is how many cycles of erosion will run. If you want your mountains to be really worn down a bit, then you'll want to run more erosion cycles. Minimum river start locations, desired river start locations. Dwarf Fortress actually maps in its world generation method the erosion cycles of the world. That is to say, it creates a world and then erodes the actual terrain like the real world would. Do we have extreme vertical cliffs kind of break off and fracture and eventually become more hill rather than, giant sheer cliff? Yes, we do. Do mountains have a dry side and a wet side like they do in the real world? Yes, ours will. Maximum number of subregions. If you allow your terrain to vary wildly, as we have, you need to make sure that this is turned up enough, because as your terrain varies, new subregions are created, and if there are too many, Dwarf Fortress will reject your world because it is too patchwork. I like to have a patchwork world, so ours is turned up. Caverns. Generally speaking, I leave these alone, but it's worth noting that openness and density can control what your caves look like. Below our fortress, where we first start, there will be various caves. If there are none of these, if you turn caverns off completely, if you turn the cavern layer number to 0, then there is no underground cavern system in your world, and dwarves don't settle underground. If you set it to 1, all of the cavern critters and plant life that exists in your cave are in that single layer. By default, there are 3 layers, and each has not only the wildlife of the one above it, but also introduces wildlife of its own. So, for example, there are certain types of trees that only show up on cavern level 3. There are certain types of trees that don't show up on cavern level 3. If you set this to have caverns only one level of cavern, everything shows up on that level. If you set it to only have 2, then some of this stuff gets moved up. Openness and passage density determine whether you're going to have big open cavern rooms or little tiny maze like, minotaur maze like corridors. Cavern layer water minimum and maximum. By default, the minimum is actually 0. I've turned this up. Give me just a moment here. Why did I turn this up? Well, it's not entirely realistic. There are dry caverns in the world. It is a real thing. Caverns eventually are left behind when the water table sinks, for example, and the cavern that was created by water originally is left with a dry cave that's no longer growing. Um, I turned this on to 1 because I want to have at least some water in all my caves, and there's a reason. In Dwarf Fortress, a dry cave is not farmable. There is no mud. If all of your caves are dry, you have no underground flora on your site. That's really, really sucky. It's not common, but it can happen. So I turn this up to 1. I like having cave moss. I like having cave trees, mushroom trees. If all of my caves are dry, I don't, and it's boring. It's caves full of mud with nothing there. Boring. So, I like my colorful caves. My caves will have at least a little water. I don't run into that problem. The end. Magma layer. Do you have a magma sea? Yes, we will have a magma sea. Why? Because we will have a bottom layer. For those of you who are wanting to avoid spoilers, you should leave this thread. You should leave this uh, broadcast now. I'm going to let you in on the secret that Dwarf Fortress players constantly talk about as clowns and candy. Here's the gist. Those of you who are Lords of the Rings fans already know the dwarves are going to be greedy. They're going to dig too deep. They're going to find evil, evil things in the dark. This bottom layer is where those evil, evil things live. We want to have evil, evil things that we can uncover, so I'm going to leave the bottom layer on. If we dig too greedily and too deep, we'll uncover it. That's just the way the game plays. These next segments deserve a moment of their own, however, because I do configure these rather heavily. Let's say you want to build a fortress. You want to build a 200-story tower above your fortress. You couldn't with my settings because Z levels above ground is set to 15, which means from the highest point on your embark, let's say you have a mountain and right next to a valley, that highest mountain peak, go 15 levels above that level, and that is the highest point you could build, conceivably. Your map is literally not taller than that. You can't build above that. This is like hitting the skybox in Minecraft. This determines basically how much sky there is up there. Whether your birds can go far above the ground or not, how tall your towers can be wherever they are built, and so forth. The next few, layers above layer 1, above layer 2, and above layer 3, are how many Z levels of dirt and stone you will have between the surface and the first cavern, between the first cavern and the second cavern, and between the second cavern and the third cavern. Now, I like to keep this reasonable. I like a fortress to be all in one place, relatively close to the surface, so I turn this up. I give myself 15 Z levels of terrain to build in. This does make your game easier, I ain't gonna lie to you. If you're having to dig around caves and wall up terrain, if you're having to spread out on one level because you can't dig deep in a vertical stack, your fortress is going to be less efficient. You're going to have a lot more things to do. Things will run more slowly. It'll be a harder game. Let's not kid ourselves. By incorporating this all together in 15Z levels, however, I keep my game running smoothly and quickly. It cuts down on dwarven pathfinding. It reduces the likelihood that I'm going to run my fortress too far, too long, and die to frame rate rather than to critters. I do like to have some levels of terrain between each of the cavern levels so that I'm not running into the issue where I'm navigating around caves that almost overlap, for example. This doesn't stop them necessarily from being linked by pits and holes, so you can have cavern level 2 connected to cavern level 3 by a giant chasm, for example. but it would mean that there was enough solid rock between those two caves for that chasm to be 5 levels deep, which is what we have here between each of the cave levels. So I'll have 15 levels of sky, 15 levels of dirt and stone, then a cave of some sort. Then after the cave, there'll be another 5 levels of stone, another cave, 5 levels of stone, another cave, and then 10 levels of stone before we hit the magma sea. And this Z levels, I guess I should say, is technically this is the magma sea depth. I'm saying I want a magma sea that's 10 stories tall, if you will. Now, this does do a couple things. It increases the amount of adamantine available to my dwarves in the world. This technically makes the game easier if you go that far, but it also means you'll have a little more adamantine to play around with. If you've never seen this stuff before, it's possible to end up with a very small amount of it and not really have a chance to play with it. If you want to play with it, you're going to need to have more of it, and the only way you can guarantee yourself to have more of it is to increase the size of the magma sea, the Z levels above layer 4. Layer 4 is the semi-molten rock, and the semi-molten rock here is 2 levels deep. Semi-molten rock is the ultimate destroying force in the world. Stuff that drops into it disintegrates. Even if it wouldn't disintegrate in magma, semi-molten rock destroys everything. Leave that on. You want to have a hard boundary between you and the nasty bad stuff at the bottom. If you're going to have Z levels at the bottom, that is to say, the place where the evil Balrogs live, then you're going to want to have a semi-molten layer above that, and you're going to want to have a magma sea so that you don't accidentally dig down too far too fast unexpectedly. This, I've found, allows me to build a compact, self-sustaining fort in those first 15 Z levels, to build, if I desire, some sort of watchman's outpost in between each cave if I want, to have plenty of adamantine available to me at the bottom of the magma sea if I want to set up a lava forge down there, for example, and just have it all extracted on site, while keeping my Balrogs at the bottom and the magma layer that keeps us separated from them. So far, so good? All right. Minimum natural cave size and maximum natural cave size are the height of your caves, minimum and maximum. My caves will always be at least 5 stories tall, and they can be up to 25 stories tall internally. How many caves will exist in the mountains by default? These are places where beasts set up camp, so I've got 6. There's some non-mountain caves out there in the rest of the world for them to set in. I make my caves visible so I can see where they are when I embark. I don't want to embark right on somebody's cave. It's an unpleasant sensation to realize you've embarked on something you don't want to be a neighbor to. I'll allow my embark options to show tunnels always. I allow 10 civilizations. I require a playable civilization of dwarves. These minimum number of elevation squares allow us to whittle down on worlds. This rejects worlds if they don't have at least this amount of terrain. Now this kind of works at loggerheads with uh, weighted uh, mesh ranges above. We're saying we want to have, for example, the same amount of minimum, low, and high across the board. Well, remember, I've weighted this to high and low, so fewer of my worlds will actually be allowed in that sense if they don't generate a high enough starting amount of mid elevation. I've got lots of low, I've got lots of high, but there's not as much mid. Now, if you're having your worlds rejected over and over and over again, these are likely culprits. If you've set your volcanism demand beyond where your ranges will allow, all your worlds will reject all of them from start to finish always. If you're playing around with these, make sure you're paying attention to your world rejects. In fact, let's make sure I have that set on. So I'm going to go out here. I'm going to save our settings here just to make sure I don't lose them. I'm going to go back to the Lazy Noob pack from our starter pack. And I think this gives us, does it have log map rejects? I thought it did. I'm probably just getting old and I'm not seeing it. It does not appear that it does. That's kind of a shame. No log map rejects. Am I just missing it? It does not look like I am. We'll have to go into those files I told you we wouldn't go into. Dun dun dun. All right, so let's go in and modify those real quick because I want to turn that on. I believe it's in DNit. Right here. This will allow us to create a log file by default that tells us why Dwarf Fortress rejected a world it tried to create. Now, since we've messed with our world settings, we didn't leave them at default, it's probably useful to us to know if we maybe set something up that can't happen. If, for example, I told them I had to have a playable civilization, that is to say dwarves, which only spawn in the mountains. If you want dwarves, they only spawn in the mountains, and you've set your map characteristics up such that no mountains can be created, you're not going to have any dwarves. It really does work that way. So the net result then at that point is that Dwarf Fortress would reject every world I ever created, and if I don't have it logged, it's not telling me why it's rejecting every world over and over and over again, which can be really, really painful if I want to know why I've set my settings the wrong way so that I can, have a world to play in. We'll turn this to yes, with as simple as changing the no to yes, and then we'll save this file. Now the problem here is that this is logged initially when Dwarf Fortress sets up, and well, we already started Dwarf Fortress, so we're going to have to end it real quick. Now keep in mind, I'm not in anything important right now, and I've already saved my settings for this world set. But we're going to use our first df hack command now. The die command kills Dwarf Fortress, exactly like you'd expect. It's literally just cutting the process off. The process just immediately stops. There's no save, there's no backup. This is the equivalent of Alt F4 on your game. Don't do it while you're saving. And when we restart, our settings will be back to where we want them to be. We'll skip past our intro movie here. Go back into our world gen settings again. And everything we had before is still here. All of our seeds and our settings are all right where we left them because we saved them before we left. So now we've got it. We're ready to go. Believe it or not, we're ready to create a world. Since I haven't saved my changes because I went into it and I haven't actually looked at it, we're going to go on. Now, it rejected 8 worlds there before it finally started creating history for me. It's going to run at most 150 years of history, and that's because I want to keep it relatively short and give us a wide variety of places to embark in. And it actually hit something that caused it to stop. I'm guessing since it's the Age of Heroes, enough of our mega beasts got killed off that it had to stop. It hit our stoppage criteria. So the age, the name of the age, actually tells you a little bit about the world itself. And there's a wide variety of these, ranging from the Age of Death to the Age of Fairy Tales. And I encourage you to go out on the wiki and look at each one of them and understand what they mean. I'm fairly certain the Age of Heroes here means that we have a certain number of mega beasts that have died off due to being killed by, well, as you might guess, heroes. We'll try to make this world work for us, though. So before we go anywhere else, we're going to export our image and info down here at the bottom. That exports some files for us that we can pull open in those Legends viewers I was telling you about earlier. And then we'll accept this world by hitting enter. And it will offload all this stuff from memory to disk, which is what it's doing. That's this whole offloading and saving thing it's doing. It's basically writing our world out for us so that we can use it. All right, it's that simple. We've created a world. Region 1 here, Somthur, the oracular universe, I believe it was, is our world. We can actually go into Legends, and first, before we do anything else, Legends allows us to view the history of our world. What happened? How many dwarf necromancers are there? Where are they located? How many vampires have infiltrated forts and, been the result of their demise? All of your historical events and things that are going on are here. Births, deaths, you name it. This is your world in census format, laid out in all the detail you could possibly want. Every fortress and town, hamlet, dark pit, cave, you name it, they're all here and represented. All of your civilizations and other groups are presented here. If you want to know what the Kingdom of Escorts was, the Kingdom of Escorts was a human civilization founded in the year that began in the year one and started founding places. Let's see. Position of Master of Beasts. They create all these positions for their civilization to hold all these noble roles. Their gladiatory competitions, story recitals, foot races. This is literally the history of our world as we're paging through, just viewed through the lens of this one civilization. But it's more than that. You can go and look at individual historical figures. For example, here is a female dragon who was the only one of her kind. Okay? And she was struck down by a human in planned exit. So she did all these things, and then she attacked this place and started eating people, and one of them fought back, and she died. These unknown creatures and her notable kills are unimportant people who got culled out when we removed all the unimportant people from our history. They're counted, but they're not actually represented here because we don't know who they were. We removed them from history. We don't care about them. They're too unimportant to remember. If you don't want to have these sorts of unknown creatures in your history, don't cull your unimportant people. Leave them in. And it will detail all of them right down to their most banal descriptions possible. It will also break up your historical world into the events that occurred by age. So the age of myth is where you start. That's where all your mega beasts are alive and well, and your civilizations have just basically woken up on the side of the beach there. And it progresses as creatures die and civilizations make war on one another and cities rise and fall through various ages. And depending on how much history you generate and how volatile your history might be, you could pass through the same age multiple times in some cases. I've heard of cases where it goes through cycles where the civilizations are powerful enough to change the name one way, and then the dragon and hydra that have been rampaging through the world since creation destroy enough of them to shift the age back to being named after them. And it goes on and on like that, back and forth through ages multiple times. Some cases, if your history goes on long enough, you can have worlds where all the playable civilizations have died out. They've simply gone away. For example, they've been killed off by the humans or enslaved by the goblins. Right on, Zeb. Welcome aboard. If you have any questions as we go along, feel free to comment. As always, I am doing this for charity. This is, well, and to help folks learn how to play the game. That's the idea, anyway. So, what do we do with all that history? Well, I tend to go back out here to Legends Viewer, and I'm going to open up our uh, Dwarf Fortress folder and get out our. Oh, where did I stick it? Nuts. I would forget where I put my Dwarf Fortress folder, wouldn't I? Okay, so Dwarf Fortress, as I was saying. In our. Let's try this again. Ha ha. Humph, says I. I must be overlooking it. I'm sure we exported it. Yeah, there they are, right there. Okay, I am, in fact, seeing them. They do exist. There's our world history and a map and our sites and population, etc., etc., etc. Okay, they are, in fact, there. That's our old region one. That's not our current one. Let's get rid of him. This is a pure dump of our information. Maybe I didn't dump all of it. I must have only dumped part of it. Let's go back into Legends mode. This cannot be allowed to stand. We'll go back into Legends and we'll do the full export from here. In case you miss it when you're doing the export from World Gen, Hey, no problem, Miss Stracco. Fair warning for all you folks out there. If you donate at least $10, you are allowed to have a dwarf named after you, not just in this fort, but in all future forts for the duration of our 38-day event. If you donate at least $25, you can have one of our starting 7 named after you, not just in this fort, for all the forts for the entire 38 days. As long as you're not naming them something terrible, I'll make it happen. Well, I'll tell you what, Estraco, if you donate another $5, I'll pretend it was a $10 donation and I won't say nothing. Fair? You donate the other 20, I'll give you one of the starting 7 that way. Fair enough? All right, so let's do our XML dump. That's X down here at the bottom. We'll punch that real quick. And that's going to export a file. And this is not a small file. Windows tells you it's hung. Don't panic. It'll get there. We're going to export our detailed map. If we wanted to export any or all of these, we can. We're going to export a few of them here. We're going to export our map gen info. That's what we exported from world gen, but we're also going to export our XML dump here. We're going to export all of our detailed maps too, because I'm just that way. Biome maps, and yes, Dwarf Fortress actually generates a hydrosphere map. No, I'm not kidding. Maps of temperature and rainfall, you name it, it's all here. If you wanted to see how it's laid out all of your world, sliced into whatever criteria you like, it's all here. Bear with me a second here. Current vegetation. If you want to know how much vegetation is in your map when you first start, this is how you do it. Salinity of your oceans. I'm not even kidding. Structures, roads, and similar buildings. Trade networks. Nobility and what they own. And diplomatic relations, all mapped out for us. Okay. Now, in theory, we can go back over here to Legends Viewer. Right on. A little late there, Extra Life notification, but thanks. Okay, and this is our XML archive, that thing I was looking for earlier and couldn't find. And it will load all of the other things for us, and then it will provide for us in infinite breakdown all the stuff you might want to know about our world. There are 5,788 dwarves in our world. Oh, I ain't blaming you, Stracco. I'm fairly aware of the conversion not going your way at the moment. It's almost like there's something going on in my country that might not be entirely good. Anyway, we have one kobold civilization, Trinkus. Well, that's it. There they are, a civilization of kobolds. One set of events right here. They are in the middle of nowhere, apparently. Oh, I take it back. They're all dead. In the year 18, in mid-autumn, this rock came out of nowhere and killed all the kobolds in the world. They're extinct. Whoops. This thing allows you, unfortunately, I have my push-to-talk key bound to the same key that it uses for forwards and backwards here, guys. Bear with me. This thing allows you to see just about everything you could conceivably imagine. Who's fought wars, how many, whether they were attacking or defending, you name it. You want to learn about all your necromancers, they're in the historical figures section. You want to learn about the geography of your world, arts and crafts like artifacts and such, your civilizations, uh, who has the biggest cities. Here it is. It's all laid out for you, exactly like you could possibly want in census status. Looks like we have one kobold civilization left. Phileamin, I'm guessing they came out of Trinkus at some point, are still out there somewhere. They have one cave that they haven't been discovered. Nobody's killed them all yet. It looks like the elves have never had to defend their own territory. They have always been on the attack. The dwarves have never attacked anyone. The elves have called themselves the Beards of Judging and gone on an attack spree. There you go. How's that for random procedural generation? Our dwarves are dicks and named them after a dwarf's favorite part. Oh. All of our historical figures, alive or dead, who got killed in which race by, we had 41 giant jaguars have been killed in battle. 171 elves have died in war. The detail here is absolutely incredible, and Dwarf Fortress really does generate all this stuff for you. It's all there in these files. That's where it's being created from. This isn't just being made up by a Legends viewer. It's actually pulled from my Dwarf Fortress saves, exports. I will leave the rest of that to you to go out and explore at your leisure. You can use DF hack export legends info to get even more information on top of what you've already seen. Now, I haven't gone into that too much. DF hack is something I've been kind of leaving for later, but here's the gist. DF hack is a command line utility, you're seeing it here, that allows us to run various, let's call them tools, to modify our Dwarf Fortress game in flight. Since Dwarf Fortress is still a game in development and is not necessarily always bug-free or stable, DF hack allows us to work around problems that we may encounter because certain features of Dwarf Fortress haven't been fully implemented or have been implemented in a fashion that's maybe a placeholder for when they eventually get implemented for real. DF hack will allow us to work around some of that. That's pretty much all we'll use it for. There's a couple of other neat things I'll use it for at Embark, I'll show you. But generally speaking, I'm not looking to use DF hack. This is not some sort of exploit trick that I enjoy using. It's something I'm using to work around Dwarf Fortress's eccentricities. Speaking of which, let's get to some of those, because we haven't yet. It's been a long time. We've only been doing this for an hour and 15 minutes, and we haven't played the game yet. Let's start at Dwarf Fortress. Ostensibly, we are now playing the game. This is Embark. This is where we will set up our world. Where do we want to have our fortress at? We can determine where we want to embark. All of these little symbols represent different terrain. This is civilization. This is an evil area. This is an ocean. This is tundra frozen. These are mountains probably of good character. Yes, they're mirthful. So these are good aligned mountains. Badlands and deserts. It's all here. If you want to embark in a particular terrain type, say you want to have a fortress in a swamp, so that you can build it up, it can fall over and then sink into the swamp, and then your third one can burn down, then fall over and sink into the swamp, and the fourth one can stay up. All the biomes have an alignment. You can have evil mountains the same way. Oh, the answer to your question is kind of remember Mordor. Evil terrain is exactly that. You're going to get storms that can make your adventurer or your dwarf into an undead monstrosity. You're going to have undead that walk the earth in evil terrain. Good terrain, you're going to see certain types of animals like fae, unicorns, for example, are only found in good terrain. There is good neutral land actually makes up most of the land. There will be some evil and there will be some good, but generally speaking, if I took all of this mountains here, and it only goes up to where these little house-shaped symbols are. It only goes up to here. This is not good. It's actually untamed wilds. This is really savage neutral area here, but it's shrubland instead of mountains. The symbols represent the terrain type. The coloration is what told me that these mountains were good. Most of our terrain will be neutral, and it's worth noting that there are different types of good and neutrality. As terrain becomes more savage, while also being good, neutral, or evil, you end up with different designators for it. So let's talk about those for a moment. Up at the top right here, you're going to see the terrain we're in. This place we're pointing at, where our fortress is going to be built right here on the local map, is a temperate conifer forest, meaning that it freezes in the winter or gets cold in the winter and gets warm in the summer, and it's primarily pine trees and not deciduous trees. It's warm, meaning that it's on the higher end of it's on the high end of the temperature scale, but not super hot. It can get up to scorching, for example. There's lots of trees, which is good if we want to build things out of wood or use wood for fuel. There's lots of other vegetation. It's thick, meaning there's lots of plants to harvest. If we wanted to have our dwarves embark with nothing because they're exiles and survive off the land, like nature dwarf, then we might want to embark someplace where there's plenty of trees to get by on and plenty of vegetation for them to pick and eat. Our surroundings here is what I was getting to earlier, though. Surroundings range in terms of savagery as well as good, neutral, and evil. So if you imagine the old nine squares alignment box for D&D, that's kind of similar, only instead of lawful and chaotic, we have savage and not savage. The more savage a terrain is, the more giant animals you'll find, and really savage terrain starts to have things like animal men, which work like their animal counterparts, except they actually have hands and feet and can move around like humanoids and use tools and such. If your terrain is on the lower end of savage, you're going to see fewer large, nasty invasions of animals. You'll still get animals. It's not like you don't get terrain. You don't get wolves in the forest or anything. But you'll stop seeing giant wolves as often. Whereas in a savage area, you'll see lots more of those giant animals, and you might see wolf men as well. Not werewolves, mind you, but wolf men. Not the same thing. One is an animal man race, and the other is an infection that will destroy your fortress. Depending on where you want to embark, you're going to want to pay close attention to your surroundings. Haunted terrain like this is evil, meaning that my butchered animals could come back to life as undead. The rain could make my dwarves into evil undead that kill their fellow dwarves. It's not a really friendly place to embark, and if you embark there, you have to be aware of the severe hazards that you will deal with. I probably won't embark on evil terrain, certainly not in this. Yeah, Ravenloft is not a bad analogy, actually. I'm not familiar with. Doesn't Ravenloft have a fog around it all the way that turns things into evil things? If you wander off too far from the beaten path, you're basically lost forever as an evil creature. Yeah, evil terrain is a lot like that. You embark in evil terrain when you want a challenge. I don't recommend new players start with evil terrain unless you just really want to see how bad it can get. Um, when I say that your butchered animals will come back to life, what I mean is you'll butcher the cow that arrived with you to eat its meat, but the bones will come back to life and kill the butcher. The hide will come back to life as an animate thing and try to strangle people. That really does happen. I'm not kidding. I'm not making it up. It's a thing. The the terrain itself can reanimate the dead. So we're not going to embark there. Nope. We're going to embark somewhere else. But while I could take my time and look through the thousands of squares of terrain that this map represents, remember, on the right-hand side is a world map, on the middle is a region map, and then where we're actually embarking is this little tiny thing over here. The local is blown up from the X on the region map right here, which is in turn blown up from the X on the world map. Now, we're using a small region, or a small world, so our world and our region are actually, the same size. But if you're embarking in a larger world, say a large world, your world will break down to multiple regions, which will then break down to local areas as you zoom in effectively. And where we want to embark, we are going to select in a specific way using DF hack. Embark Assistant is a DF hack tool. It's not included with the native game. You'll notice all that stuff popped up when I type this in. It allows me to use a more advanced and robust version of the innate vanilla version Site Finder to find terrain I want to embark in. It allows me to be far, far more specific about what I'm looking for in a site. So if I was a player and I want to start off and I want to have my dwarves making bronze on site, I'm going to need both tin and copper to do that. Embark Assistant will guarantee, if it exists, my ability to find a site that has both tin and copper. Again, assuming one exists. So to do that, we're going to go into Find Embark. We're going to set up our criteria. I want to have our X and Y dimension as 4 by 4, so that means our dwarf map will be 4 sections wide by 4 sections tall. Our local map, remember we were talking about world zooms down to region, zooms down to local? Well, you see these 4 tiles here at the top, and this is a 4 by 4 region. Each one of those individual tiles blows up into what our dwarves stand in. This isn't a 4 dwarf wide area. This is like 48 by 48 or 64 by 64. I forget what the exact local tiles break down to by size. You'll have to forgive me. Too large of an embark can make it slow for your computer to process. You can run into that frame rate problem we were talking about earlier. So what do we want? Well, we don't want evil. I want no evil. So we're going to set evil off. We're going to set our aquifer. Now, in prior broadcasts, I used to tell new players to avoid aquifers entirely. Oh my god, aquifers are evil. Avoid them. Don't do it anymore. No. Keep your aquifer, but only if it's a light aquifer. Heavy aquifers are still the devil, and I advise new players to avoid them like the plague. Light aquifers are useful and not particularly disrupting, and they're a good introduction to aquifers in general. So, I will tell it I want to have less than or equal to light, meaning I can have no aquifer on my site, and I'll be okay with that. But if I have an aquifer, it's going to be no more than a light aquifer. I won't have any heavy aquifers to deal with. Do I want to have a river? Okay, I'll say I want my maximum river to be no more than a brook. Uh, Major rivers are things like the Mississippi or the Nile. Minor rivers are going to be things like more like the Ohio or some of the smaller rivers that feed into those. Streams are the little, uh, I would say creeks, but creeks are actually more like brooks. Streams are waterways that don't get so shallow you could trip over them. Brooks are like the little creek that used to run behind my house, which was just a little bit deeper than a drainage ditch. If it got too dry, you'd end up with puddles and pebbles instead of a brook. Now, Dwarf Fortress doesn't simulate your brook drying out, but that give you an idea of what you're picturing. So I want no more than a brook. I don't care if we don't have one, but I don't want to deal with one that I have to bridge across. Dwarves can walk across a brook, but they have to put a bridge across a stream or anything bigger. Minimum waterfall drop. I don't need a waterfall on my site, so we don't care. If I wanted to eliminate waterfalls, I could tell it I want it to be absent. Do I want it to be flat? We'll try for flat. We'll try for clay. We'll try for sand. May not be able to get all this on one site. It may not exist on one site. We'll try for coal. This is a lot of stuff to ask for, you understand. Minimum soil minimum soil is at least some. I want to have some soil on my site. If you're embarking in the mountains, it's possible to end up in an area where, you're embarking right on the hard rock, for example, and there is no soil. If you set your site finder in such a way that you can't find the site you're looking for, you're not going to find it. Do you want to have terrain that's frozen, tundra frozen? I don't really care. But if you do, you'll need to set it. Let's see. Can your blood rain cause syndromes? No, I don't want to have anything happen to my dwarves because they were out in the rain beyond what will already happen to them. There you go. Reanimating terrain plus thralling clouds. Oh, yummy. For those folks who really want to experience the masochistic best that Dwarf Fortress has to offer. Minimum adamantine, I want at least some. Maximum adamantine, I don't care. I want at least some. Do you want to have magma in your caves? I'm not going to worry about too much of this stuff other than making sure I have some adamantine on site for later. Regions and biomes and trees, I'm not worried about that. Now, metals I care about. Metals I care about. Since I want to be able to demonstrate making bronze from on-site metals if necessary, I'm going to try for tin and copper, which is what will get you bronze, and I'm also going to try for iron, so I can make iron and steel on site. Remember, I've already said that I want to have flux present, so if I have iron and flux, that's not only iron, that's steel. And if I have tin and copper, that's bronze. So I have bronze, iron, and steel available on this site if I'm asking for it. If you want to have a particular economic stone or a particular stone type, say you want to build a tower, but it must be made from obsidian or it must be made from granite, this is where you would go to set that. This allows you to guarantee that a certain stone type appears on your site. Do I want to have a necromancer as a neighbor? I'm not worried about it one way or the other. Let's see what it gives us. But if I wanted to force my site to be next door to a necromancer, I can set the tower availability. How many civilizations are near? Do I want to have elven, human, or goblin neighbors? I want to try and have all of these. So I don't care about the kobolds so much, but the elves and humans and goblins can come to trade or invade, and I want to have those present if possible. So I'm going to save that setting real quick so I can come back to it real quick, and then we're going to hit find and see what it finds for us. Now it's going to scan through our world, looking at all the terrain to see if any of it matches up with what we asked for. Now we were pretty specific, so it's very possible we won't find anything. There are a couple spaces that do have what we want. If you squint really close at our region map here, let me zoom in a bit. These green X's indicate where Embark Assistant has located a suitable embark that meets the criteria we set. Now, to actually get it, we have to embark in such a way that the upper left corner of our embark is on one of these green X's. Okay? So this would get us what we wanted, and and this would get us what we wanted because those two would contain it. But if I embarked all the way up here, I'm not going to find what I'm looking for. So the only set of places that has all our criteria is here, here, there, and there. These 4 tiles on that one region. That's it. Nothing else here will meet all the criteria we set. Likewise, if I went down to this next section, there's only one here. If I don't put the local area right there, it's not going to meet all the criteria I set. Similarly, there's a couple of small areas here and a bigger one here and there. So let's take a look. Let's go back to, this was adjacent to the stream. It almost got us the stream included, unfortunately. Doesn't look like we'll get to include it all if we don't. Kind of would like to have a stream if possible, or a brook if possible, but I'm not necessarily stuck on it per se. Let's zoom back out here a bit. Okay. What do you think we're going to get for terrain here? Looks like this is all deserts, and I don't really want to embark in a desert for our first go-round. Grasslands is not much better. There's not much trees to work with for new players. It's hard to explain some things, but it'll work if that's all I'm going to get. Harumph, harumph. Looks like it's going to be, ooh, wait, is that desert too? Desert and savanna, probably. Now, you'll have actually multiple biomes represented in your embark. Notice these F keys down here, F1, F2, F3, for viewing the different biomes. These are the segments of the environment that make up my site. So, for example, this biome, F1, makes up this bottom right-hand portion of my embark. F2 makes up this left-hand side, and F3 makes up the top right-hand, just this little tiny piece up at the very top. If I were to embark here, I'm going to have iron and gold and silver and copper, zinc, tin, lead, bismuth, marble, and cassiterite, bituminous coal, clay, and sand. This is actually pretty good. But it's got a necromancer tower, and I don't really want to drop my new players right in on a necromancer tower. So we're going to see if we can get something a little further away, maybe. May not have a choice. Again, I'm limited to what the embarks give us here if I'm going to embark in this world with these settings. This is what happens when you do it live, kids. If I were more prepared, I would have had an embark already created. I would have demonstrated world generation, and then I would have gone and picked out the previously created world I'd pre-baked for everyone. Alas, you guys are going to get it live, as it were. So let's see. We're going to have temperate grasslands and deserts. Not a lot of wood for us to deal with in this area. That's interesting. All right. Now, Estraco, is that your? I see there that we've got the. We're up to $10 now. Was that your second donation, mate? We got to get you a dwarf named here in a minute, right? Not one of our starting seven, but we've got to have one named after you. Do you have a trade preference you want him to do? Want to be my beekeeper? Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the other. So this is fairly flat, no cliffs. It'll be a nice flat map. That's nice. Means it's easy to see everything that's going on in one screen, if you will. Further to the north, as we get closer to this stream, you'll see that the elevation changes. So we're like high up on a riverbank, and then it goes down towards the valley of the river, where the river flows through, and then back up the other side. This tells you how steeply it descends. The one means it's just kind of a gentle slope. So we're on a flat plateau, and it sort of banks down slowly to where the riverbed is, and then it goes back up the other side to a nice flat area on the other side. So this is like this area we're embarking in is the riverbank overlooking a very shallow, wide, shallow valley. Let's see. There's a necromancer tower nearby, so we're going to have to deal with necromancers. We're not at war with the goblins when we start, or the elves for that matter. That's good. Being at war when you start makes things a lot harder. Having a necromancer tower adjacent makes things a lot harder. We get to determine whether we want to be the Tours of Brightness or the Bearded Attic. And since I didn't look up in advance to see whether these guys have steel tools or not, we're just going to roll the dice, and I'm going to open it up to chat. Which civilization is ours, guys? The Bearded Attic or the Tours of Brightness? Speak up quick! The polls are open! Oh, Valdemar, one of those first seven named after him. Well, a vote of only one is unanimous. We will be the Bearded Attic. So, this looks like a reasonable place to start. May not be the best, but we'll go with it. Okay? We're going to embark here on the border of a desert and a grassland overlooking a wide valley. Now, I'm going to use Clitodev's annotated craft lord's profile. Assuming, of course, I can get text will be text to play along here now that I've zoomed my map a few times. Wow, that's horrible. Give me a second here. Sometimes the font does not want to play along with me. If I zoom the wrong way. There we go. That'll do. Make it work. Now, as much as I'd love to, Clitodev's setup here isn't quite what I would do by default. So let's first look at what problems we have, because most of the stuff's not going to... No iron anvils, no coal, no bauxite, no malachite, no sand. Fuck this noise. We're out. Can't do iron anvils. That's terrible. Wow. That's going to cost us 200 more points than normal. Whoo, buddy. Painful embark. And you guys wanted to be these guys. Wow. No, I'm just messing with you. This can happen. Whether you pick out an existing profile like we're doing here, or you create one from scratch, it's possible for your dwarven civilization to not have iron anvils, or bituminous coal, or bauxite, malachite, and sand. Yikes. So let's do all this from scratch. Okay, was planning to preface this with a discussion of how I do things differently from Clinidev's setup, but we're probably going to have to recreate some of this from scratch pretty much all the way through. Excuse me. So the first thing we're going to need is a steel anvil, so we can actually do metalworking. And steel anvils are really super expensive. It's a whole lot better if your civilization has access to iron to use the iron. Much better. Much better. An iron anvil would have only run me 100 embark points instead of 300. Now, we can save a few points right off the bat because Clinidev brings some finished goods here. And generally speaking, for embarks, the rule is if you bring the raw stuff, you use fewer points. You get more goodies. If you bring raw ore and don't bring tools, you can make more tools on site with the ore you bring than you could have purchased with buying the tools directly. So normally, instead of bringing, say, for example, copper picks, I'll bring copper ore and make the picks on site. Now, and specifically, I'll actually try to make bronze. So in this case, we're going to make, it looks like we've got copper bars and cassiterite. But we didn't have any malachite, so we don't have any source of copper. So let's see what kind of stone we can do here that actually has copper in it. There's copper nuggets. Do we have... Oh, wow, we have no copper at all? This is rough, guys. Really rough. Whew. Not the kind of embark I would do for new players. Screw it. Let's back out for a second and see if we can get the other civilization real quick. See if we can get that same embark site. We'll use the other civilization and see if we can get iron anvils and some of the things I would normally bring. I don't want to, but at the same time, that's a rough way to start off a new player. We'll do that challenge embark stuff on a later stream. We've got 38 days of this stuff, right? And we reload our settings from before, and we can just re-find it. And it's the same world, so we'll find the same places as before. Having saved our settings allows us to get right back to that same embark if we want. Faster than I can eat my grilled cheese sandwich. There we are. There's our grassland and desert overlooking that wide valley. Let's pick the... see there? We're at war with the tower if we're on the other civilization. So see, there's a downside. I might get all the stuff I want, but the zombies are going to show up earlier. Good God, not my best day, is it? All right, well, war with the zombies or steel anvils and no copper. Not making this any easier. Okay. Screw it. We'll try this and see if we can survive long enough to get underground before the zombies show up. Let's see if we have the same problems. We might have the problems in this one too. No malachite. Well, we can deal with that. Malachite we're using because it's a copper ore. And for those of you who aren't familiar with all your geology and mineralogy, now you're going to play Dwarf Fortress and you're going to get really familiar really fast. Before I began playing Dwarf Fortress, I could not have told you that cassiterite was an ore of tin, that you would get tin out of it. Would not have been able to tell you. And now that I played Dwarf Fortress, I will never be able to forget. So here's what we're doing. I'm going to bring a bunch of raw goods and skilled dwarves. Okay? A few animals. And then we're going to arrive on our site. Now, Clinidev has a particular arrangement he likes to bring that allows him to set certain things up right at the beginning quickly. And most of his setup I keep, as is even. But I get rid of some of the prepared goods. See here, we've got rope and cloth, which are made from thread. Now, there's 17 points in these two items, the cloth and the rope. But if I go down here, I can put a lot more thread in when I get rid of those points. Now, not that many, because we actually have some points left over from the malachite I didn't get. But 17 points would get me 2 additional thread items with points left over, 5 points left over, in fact. At which point I could go up here and say, get rid of 1 point of sand, and come back down here and add another point of thread. And now I have 4 units of thread, which is enough to have the thread that we would have had, make a cloth, make a rope, and make something else on the side as well. Every time you have the opportunity to bring raw goods, I recommend doing so. Now, there are some exceptions. You can run into problems if, for example, you don't bring a copper battle axe. You can run into a problem where you can't cut trees if you don't have a way to make axes. It used to be in older versions, and I encouraged new players originally to bring wooden axes to cut the trees with. That, once upon a time, was allowed to work. It no longer does. Today, I recommend that you bring a copper battle axe if you can. It's the cheapest axe you can bring that will allow you to cut trees on demand. If you're really feeling your oats, you can go without it, but remember, it's like an anvil now. If you miss this thing, you're going to wait till autumn. You're going to wait 3 seasons before you'll be able to buy one of your own. We could theoretically make a copper battle axe using the materials we bring with us. I have done that on previous streams, and we could certainly do it here. But I like having the one axe for safety if you're a new player. Now today, we're going to get rid of it because we want those 68 points. I'm greedy that way. Cassiterite is an ore of 10, but we have no copper ore listed here, so we need to get a copper ore. So let's go down to our stone section here. And there it is. And get our copper ores. Now, copper ores are malachite, which it didn't have any of, remember? But you can also get copper nuggets, if there are any. Doesn't look like we have native copper anywhere in our site, so we're not going to get that either. And failing that, there's tetrahedrite. And tetrahedrite is a little more expensive because it's not just copper, it's also silver. And so the game knows that you'd potentially be able to benefit more from this than you would have from a straight copper ore. And it charges about 50% more for tetrahedrite than it would for the other ore. That's a pity, but we'll deal with it. So we're going to bring 10 of those so that we can mix them with our cassiterite and get bronze. Now, if I wanted to get the silver, I'd have to break down the tetrahedrite first, I believe. I don't think you can make it straight into bronze and keep the silver that way. That's unfortunate, but I'm much less worried about making more value than I am about having useful items right out of the gate. Seeds. I like to bring lots more seeds than we have listed here. Let's see. 15, 15, and 15 is good. I like cave wheat and sweet pods as well. But I don't really care about dimple cups all that much. Dimple cups are only used for dye, and while dyeing things is a great way to make them more valuable, at the start I'm more worried about food. And you can always order more dimple cup dye later, or make more later. It's not something you need at the initial start. If you want to be able to plant your own dye crop, however, bring at least one. We're going to bring plenty of booze. Let's see, we're bringing 84. Am I reading that right? 84 booze? Wow, that's a lot of booze. We'll go through it in no time, believe it or not. Likewise, we're bringing 40 plump helmets. Plump helmets are versatile. They could be used to make more beer, or excuse me, more dwarven wine, or they could be eaten raw or cooked into meals. Now, you have a choice here. Plump helmets are not the cheapest food, and if you're going to eat them, you're better off bringing, say, fish and meat instead of the plump helmets. You'll pay half as much for each unit. You can bring twice as much with you. If you really want to exploit the embark system, you can do so by bringing a variety of things. For example, if I bring one prepared yak tripe here, and then I bring one wombat tripe, each of these items will have its own barrel because food comes in barrels. Once that one unit of yak tripe is moved or eaten, that barrel is free, and I got the free barrel for nothing almost, literally. The yak tripe itself costs 2 units, and I get the barrel for free. So if you spread out your food across lots and lots of different types, you can end up with a lot of free barrels. Likewise, sand comes in a free bag, so a single point of sand here comes with not just the single unit of sand, but also a bag that's worth a huge amount. If I wanted to bring that bag itself, it would vary by how much, the cost would vary by how much or by what type of material it was made from, but cheap bags go for 10 points. Expensive bags can be a lot more. So a 10-point bag for free for spending a single point on sand. You can dump the sand out later if you're not going to use it for anything, but you can keep the bag. We will need a few things to get us set up. So the only other thing I can think of, let me look through his list here and make sure there's nothing else I want to change out right away. I'm going to leave the plump helmets, though normally I'd probably bring meat and fish for the bonus value. We'll leave the plump helmets in this time and just leave them. We've got enough dogs that we have mated pairs, female and male, and you have at least 2 males because sometimes your males don't really want to do the job you're hiring to do. And I'm not kidding, you can have males that don't do the job. It's really rough to bring dogs with the intent of raising a bunch of war dogs and then end up with the single male you brought with you is a little too shy to get it properly finished. That sucks. Don't do that. Bring 2 males. I don't bring more than a single cat. Cats adopt dwarves. That's actually a bad thing long term. Since you don't have control over the process and you don't want to crush some poor dwarf's pet unless you absolutely have to, cats tend to reproduce without upper bound if they're not properly gelded and crushed. So we're only going to bring 1 male. We'll control population later, but to start off, I don't want to have our cats populating the world before I'm ready for them. 1 is enough. Now, Klenedev doesn't bring any grazers with us. Some of the other things I would... he's got birds, but he brings the wrong birds in my opinion. I wouldn't bring guinea hen. I'd bring blue peafowl. And the reason I bring blue peafowl is that they have meat and leather as well as the eggs. If you're doing this solely for an egg industry, then you are better off using guinea hens. They produce more eggs in the whole. And if eggs is the sum total of what you're worried about, that's the way you go over blue peahen. But if you're intending to have a churn in your livestock, and I would suggest that you normally will anyway, blue peahen grow up just as fast as guinea hens do, produce almost as many eggs, can be butchered for meat and a skin. Whereas guinea hens don't produce the meat, the bones, they're too small for all that. So you get lots of eggs, but nothing else. I like being able to mass butcher birds in a wave to generate large quantities of leather in-house without being forced to rely on trade. So this is one of those areas where I differ specifically because my goal is a little different than the person creating the setup. I want to have the variety of animals for different uses, whereas the original setup is purely for eggs. And believe me, in terms of pure eggs, it's better. You're better off with the guinea hens than you are my blue peafowl, just for eggs. The moment you add anything else, though, your scope starts changing pretty quick. So let's go over here. What would I have done if I took my plump helmets out? Well, 40 plump helmets is 160 points, whereas 40 units of meat is only 80. 80 units of embark points with my existing 40 is 120. That's enough for me to buy, for example, a sow and a boar, and I can start producing pork effectively in-house on day 1. You could bring a ewe and a ram and start producing wool on day 1 if you wanted. In a lot of times, I'll recommend that as an idea for new players. It's possible very early, it doesn't happen very often, but it's possible very early to have a situation where your dwarves demand wool for a particular task, and not having it on hand can result in the loss of a dwarf. Likewise, they could demand access to leather, and you're going to have access to it. Now, leather's not so bad. Bone's not so bad. We can get those from the draft animals that pull our wagons to the site. We get 2 of those for free. We can butcher those for meat and skins and bones right off the bat and have some of that available. But wool is a little harder to come by. Only alpaca and sheep produce wool, and you're not going to have either of those pulling your wagon. Additionally, sheep and pigs also produce milk, which can be made into cheese. So there's a source of food there as well. You can milk them for cheese. So these more expensive animals have value beyond their use as guard animals. I recommend you bring adult animals and not child animals for a reason. There's no functional difference points-wise between, say, a puppy and a fully grown female dog, but the fully grown female dog can start reproducing new dogs on day 1, while the puppy has to grow up first. So you're paying the same points for an animal you can't immediately use. If you're doing a sort of roleplay setup, I can see it, but otherwise, bring fully grown animals. So, what do we got? We've got food, drink, seeds, some thread to make cloth items with right out of the gate. We added back our tetrahedrite, so we have copper to go with our tin to make bronze. That brings us to the smelting stuff that I recommend you take with you when you start. You're going to have an anvil. You can't do any metal work without an anvil. If you don't have an anvil, it's 3 seasons before you might see your first one. Maybe. You're not guaranteed to see one that first year. Could be year 2 or year 3 before you see one, potentially. We'll need a unit of fuel to prime our reaction. Coke is a processed coal fuel, for those of you who are not familiar with it. That's true. Kittens do all the work of a cat, but don't cats bloat for a little longer. That's one case where you could probably make an argument for bringing the juvenile rather than the adult. If you're worried about reproduction and you don't want to have to pay attention to your cat for a moment, you could switch the male cat for a male kitten, get all the benefits, not have to worry about him reproducing before you're ready. Most of the rest of these animals, though, you're usually going to either be using them for meat, in which case you're usually better off just bringing the meat rather than the animal, or you're going to be using them for an animal industry of sorts, where you're basically raising them in a farm as a farm, like a cattle ranch would be. In that case, you're going to need to have fully grown animals to start your reproducing to build your stock as fast as possible. You'll get most of it from trading regardless, but every bit helps, and you're going to need as much as you can get. So, adult animals. Smelting. Anvil for metalwork, coke for fueling the reaction, copper bars for making our first item. Okay? Coke and copper bars gives us the ability to make our first axe right out of the gate without having to bring one. A unit of coke and a unit of copper is 20 units. Now, we're not going to use the coke for that. I'll get into that in a moment. But I could bring 3 times as many axes, and then some, by bringing coke and copper rather than bringing finished axes. Now, we're not going to use our coke for that. We're going to use it to make more coke, actually, first. We'll use this coke to burn the coal to make more coke to make more coke. Oh, but we're also going to make some bronze along the way. We'll take our cassiterite and our tetrahedrite and use those to make bronze. And we'll use that bronze to make weapons and armor for our dwarves right out of the gate. Now remember, we embarked near a tower, so our first order of business is going to be getting up fortifications as quick as possible. And there are 2 ways to go about this. The first way is build walls in a ceiling, and the second way is undermine it and put it in the ground as fast as possible. Clinadev's setup is designed to allow you to implement the undermine it as fast as possible method. And the way you do that is you dig out from underneath the wagon, put a support in under it, and then collapse it all into the hole and ceiling over the hole. And everything you need is in the ground at that point. You don't have to make all the separate trips to move all the stuff around. We may have to do that this time because we embarked at war with the tower. We may get eaten in the first season if we don't. We've got our smelting stuff. Oh, logs and sand. These are basic materials. Logs are used to make beds and other wood items when we first embark. We don't have a lot of wood on site, so bringing extra wood would probably be a good thing. Certain items, i.e. beds, can only be made from wood. Doesn't matter what other things you might have. You're only allowed to make beds from wood. It's just the rules of the world. So if we want to make beds, and we do, we're going to need to have enough wood on hand when we arrive to do so. We're embarking in a desert, and while there may be a few saguaro trees floating around, there won't be many, and there won't be much. Likewise, our grassland may have a few scrubby trees, but it's not going to be much to build out of. Since we can't build, we're going to have to look at doing something a little different. We could make sand blocks into glass blocks and build our fortress out of glass blocks, for example. We can undercut the wagon, dump it in a hole, and use sand to make glass flooring over the top of the hole, and thereby wall ourselves in. We could make it out of metal if we wanted to, though that's a little more expensive. We could bring enough stone. Stone's not super expensive. It's only about 3 units per unit. You can make blocks out of it to get more punch for your purchase. And I think in this case, since we embarked, I was going to leave the plump helmets, and they're just nagging at me. See there, Clinadev? I told you, the min-maxing, it won't let me stop. So we're going to pull some of these out. I'm going to leave a few so we can brew some stuff early on if we need to, hopefully. But we're going to put in some fish and some meat, and I'm using cheap meats and cheap fish, 2 points each, and I'm not bothering to exploit the barrels here. If I wanted to modify the number of units of each I got, I could change the number of barrels I got for free, and I'm not bothering to exploit that right now. I'm just going to go ahead and replace what we took out. That buys us back some additional points, and I can take those points and dump them into more wood. Remember, we're embarking in a desert here. Normally I wouldn't bring anywhere near this much wood, but desert. And we're 1 point short of another one, so I'll dump another unit of sand and buy that. In fact, I'll dump 4 units of sand, and we'll bring it to a nice round 40 logs. Now, this is a little different setup than I would normally bring in most embarked terrains, because normally you can depend on having some trees to cut for more wood than you'll ever need. You can rely on not being at war with the local necromancers guild, so they don't show up too early, which gives you time to build fortifications on the surface rather than having to worry about undermining the terrain or something similar. I think that's everything in our items and our animals. We've covered our cats, our dogs, and our blue peahen. We don't have enough points because we're bringing plump helmets and wood to buy pigs or sheep this time out. We'll skip them this time, unfortunately. Now, Clitodev's group of dwarves have skills already laid out. You have engravers and armorsmiths, weaponsmiths, and metalsmiths, and the setup is perfectly viable out of the gate. There's a few skills which are done for flavor that you could change out. If you look through them, you'll find, I'm trying to remember which ones have it. The pump operator here is also a fluid engineer. Fluid engineering doesn't do anything in the current version. If you wanted to get him a more useful skill, you could conceivably do so. As I recall, and I keep meaning to experiment with it, and I don't ever get around to it. By default, nobody gets both the consoler skill and the liar skill. You can't have both by default, but you can actually create a dwarf with both. What I don't know is whether he'll actually continue to gain skill in both as he goes along. If he does, giving your dwarf both consoler and liar and making him your mayor and your trade broker would go a long way, because he'd be able to lie about the value of goods and then turn right around and console your dwarven citizenry at the same time. Got to put that on my list of things to tinker with and experiment with. Let's see, what else are we bringing here? I have metalsmith, metal crafter. Metal crafter is used for making metal trade goods, mugs and similar totems and rings and earrings and that kind of thing. Gem setters are for putting gems on all those things he makes. Weaponsmith will let us get our this is a militia guy. This is our doctor. Wound dresser, diagnostician, bone doctor, suturer. Discipline. I need to look and see if they all have discipline. No, just the one guy. Just the one guy. Okay, so we'll have to use this guy for burying our corpses. He's the only guy that won't freak out at the first sight of a corpse. He's the only guy with discipline. There are more skills here than I could possibly run down in any length of time that would be reasonable. And we still haven't actually, played yet. This is all setup stuff, right? Still. I encourage you to go out to the wiki for everything related to Dwarf Fortress, but especially for things that I'm not going to cover in huge depth. I'm not going to tell you the true function of the wind instrumentalist skill and why you don't need to take it at Embark. I'm simply going to take the skills we're given in this package and run with them for now. But if you want to set up a custom Embark where all your dwarves are traveling musicians, and the only thing they have is a few donkeys that they ride from show to show on, the last of their beef jerky, and a few gold coins, you can set up an Embark profile that will let you have that. For folks who want to do the sort of story building that I see a lot of times out of games of RimWorld, you can do that here in Dwarf Fortress. There are a lot of tools in this game to help you. Now, we'll take this set of skills as is. I'm not going to mess around with the little jiggery pokery on Fluid Engineer and the flavor skills that Clitodev has included. We'll leave those as is. Before we go, though, we've got to name our fort, our group, and get a symbol. Now, the fortress, I'm sorry, guys, is mine. We have a default name here. Toss it Herbarum, the Armored Fist of Artifice. Now, group names. Normally I don't mess with these. I don't really sweat too much about what my dwarves want to call themselves. But I'll open it up to the floor here for you folks. If you want to name our Dwarven Settlements group, this isn't the settlement itself, it's the group of dwarves that inhabit our settlement. Their organization, their union, if you will. I'll open it up. Sky's the limit, guys. Shout them out. Otherwise, I'll random it for a bit and then settle on something that sounds like it's not too objectionable. Don't laugh. I'm pretty sure that at least one point our dwarves were named the Penetrating Pillars, I thought, at one point. Bodices of Mercy, anyone? The Crickets of No Opinion. Don't tempt me. If I can find something that's the Crickets of Apathy, perhaps? The Crickets of Ennui? Now you've got me wondering of... Do we have apathy? No, there's no such thing as apathy. Alas. There's no ennui either. I had to check. There probably aren't crickets either. It's not an exhaustive list, alas, alas. No, no crickets. Gonna have to add those. We're gonna have to invent new words for the Dwarven language, stick them in here. Oh man, this goes on and on. The number of words, I mean, it's not, like I said, it's not exhaustive. It isn't every word you could think of, but it's pretty broad. What do you want? Closest to what? It'd be my question. Not sure what bug types there might be in the list. Hang on a minute. Let's see if we can. And it's not even... this isn't even... If we could do plural, the critters, that'd be nice, but we don't have plural for critter. Grr. Beetles? Is beetles one of them? Let's see. Do we have beetles? Battles? Beetles. Yes, we do have beetles. We can do beetles. Okay, the beetles of chirping. Probably closest I can get to crickets. Chirping. Why can't I put an adjective on the of? The beetles of angry chirping. Indecision. I like that one. Let's go with indecision. No, no dice there. Alas. Quietness is probably there. Maybe? Nope. And unfortunately, not all of these... Where's non-quiescence? I don't know about you, but I've never heard a cricket that was quiet. Let's random for a second and come back to it. The beetles of incineration. They're only beetles because dwarves apparently don't have a word for cricket. I will note for the record that while I am not an entomologist, I am fully aware that beetles are not crickets and crickets are not beetles. All right, all right, all right. You want it, you get it. Any adjectives? Don't have chirping as an adjective, I don't think. No, not big on gerunds, these folks. The bald beetles of quietness. Speaking for the middle-aged men in the room. I can do profane. Let's do profane. That works. All right. So let's go to symbol for a moment here. Creature. Okay, so let's see. Is making a plaintive gesture. Is weeping. It is a fantastic arrangement of things. By no means, like I said, is it comprehensive, but you could randomize your list for a long time and not see duplications even of subsections of your naming. Um, let alone, once you start getting into objects and shapes and historical figures. I think last year we had a fortress whose symbol was a sheep riding a dwarf. It covers quite a lot. Okay, so let's have our dwarves plead with our poor beetles. Oops, nope, nope, nope. Keep working. We want to hit done. Okay, so there's the ardent craft has its symbol now. Let's save this temporarily, and I'm not going to overwrite Clinidev's list here, so I've got to clear this all out. We're just going to call this Day 1 Embark. That way, if I need to pull it out of my settings later, I can pull it out and provide it for you guys in case somebody wants to know exactly what I embarked with today. Let's embark and get slaughtered by zombies. Got to give you something to look forward to, right? Too far along, guys. I'm assuming you can still hear the music in the background. And I am loud enough to speak over it. Okay, so let's take a look around. First, we'll zoom way out. This whitish gray area off to the right-hand side here is our desert, and this is grassland. And you can see a few trees here and there. There's a couple big trees, little trees, some shrubby bushes. Our dwarves are embarked around their wagon right here in the middle. When you embark, they'll always be in the middle. Too faint? Okay, hang on a second. Please excuse the Hall of Mirrors effect, but I have to do this to adjust my sound. Actually, let me equalize it the other way. That a little better? Still hear over me, no problem? Okay, good. That's what I want to make sure. Sometimes sound sense can get a little drowning, and I don't want to lose you guys. After all, this is kind of for your benefit, right? At least in theory. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit here. Here's our dwarves. Oh, sorry, I didn't quite cover everything. There's a few ponds. You can see the blue here where the water is out on the surface. Those may or may not survive since we're in a desert and it may dry out. Now, we don't have a source of water here on the surface other than those ponds. Normally, I would have embarked near a brook and dumped it out, but, you know, in this case, I'm not going to. Before we get underway, before we do anything else, though, however, Rith Rodem Bomrek. See if... Nope, not going to play along. Hang on a minute. Remember earlier I was telling you we were going to use Dwarf Fortress over, or Dwarf Therapist over and over and over again, and so we shall. Dwarf Therapist is going to allow us to set labors on our dwarves, allow us to change what they're doing at any given moment, what they are allowed to do at any given moment, as well as providing us with the ability to see what they're doing at a given moment. So, for example, right now, this mechanic is not doing anything. These guys are all idle. They're literally doing nothing at the moment. But that's not what we want them to be doing. We want them to be doing other things. Specifically, I want my furnace operator to be smelting ore. I want my weaponsmith to be making weapons. I want my... and so on and so forth. I want my base to be making cut blocks and so on. So, Rith Rodem Bomret. Assuming, of course, I can type. $25 donation gets you one of the first 7, guys. Don't forget. Okay, and our first member of the starting 7 has been named. There we go. In Dwarf Fortress, he'll show up under that name from now on. Okay, having taken care of that, don't think I forgot about you, Estraco. I just have to wait for a migrant to arrive to get yours. Let's set things up. I think in our current version, at war with that, there's probably enough wood here to get by on. We're going to try it. Okay. We're going to set up a metalsmith's forge and a smelter. Metalsmith's Forge is a workshop, and the smelter is a furnace. Those are under different keys. And if you're new to the game and you're playing along trying to follow me, I apologize for not telling you every key I'm going to hit, but here's the gist. By default, if you're not looking at anything and you hit tab a few times, a fold-out panel will pop out with all of the hotkeys on it. And if I tell it I want to build a workshop, it will then give me the hotkeys for all the workshops. Now, a lot of this stuff, I'm afraid, is way down to muscle memory, and I'm not going to spend my time reciting each button press as I go through the game. If you have questions about what I'm doing or how I did it, feel free to ask. But I'm going to assume most folks will be able to read the in-game menus to understand which buttons I'm pushing for which thing when I tell them what item I'm building. So we're going to build the Metalsmith's Forge because that's where we're going to make our tools. We're going to build a smelter because that's where we're going to make our ore into ingots. Notice that these items don't just need their, like for example, this needs metalsmithing to make the forge, but the furnace also needs architecture. Now, Clinidev's setup by default has one of our guys having architecture. If no one were assigned to architecture at all, then no one would ever build the smelter. It would sit there forever and never get done. In D&D terms, for those of you who are familiar, dwarves are the most lawful of lawful things. If you tell them they're not allowed to do something, they will not do it, even on pain of death. Dwarves will starve to death rather than eat forbidden food. A dwarf burrowed into an area and told that he's not allowed to leave will die rather than go elsewhere. So, if you want these things to be built, you have to make sure you have the skills for each one as we go. Now, we're lucky, like I said, Clinidev's setup gives us architecture on one of our dwarves right away. When we unpause it, you're going to see our dwarves here rushing out to each one of these to build them one at a time. I think this is our mason here building our smelter, and our weaponsmith or armorsmith building our forge. Now, the forge is up, but we don't have any ore to use. We don't have any ingots to use or bars to use yet. We're still waiting on the smelter to get done here. Come on, there we go. Now, we only brought one unit of fuel. It's worth noting here because I have to use this first unit of fuel very carefully to make more fuel. If I don't, then I'm going to use that unit of fuel up and I have no more fuel. That's bad. We don't want to do that. So it's coke from bituminous coal and then bronze bars from ore over and over and over again. Now what's going to happen is our dwarf is going to go, oh, I need to make some coke. So he's going to grab the bituminous coal. He's from the wagon. He's going to drag that into the shop. He's going to grab a unit of coke, his fuel, from the wagon. And he's going to drag that into his shop. And he's going to convert that coal into more coke, thereby providing us more fuel. Now the conversion is not one-to-one. Coal breaks down into more than one unit of fuel per unit of coal. You can deconstruct the wagon. I don't recommend doing so if you can avoid it. It scatters your shit everywhere. And since we're going to be at war with the necromancers here very soon, I'm really wanting to keep everything kind of condensed as quickly as possible. I'm going to try and build us up a small hut, if you will, that we can hole up in while we get a proper fortress constructed. But before I can do that, I've got to have them make some coke, make some bronze, and then make some axes and picks. Because right now, we don't have any weapons or tools of any sort. I got rid of the axe for more points, remember? Which is a bit of a gamble. I won't lie to you. Now, this takes a minute. Oh. Yeah, Buzzard and Raven fighting with our dogs, probably. Okay, and they have now, if I query this, he's now gone on to the make bronze job. He finished the coal job, which I had on repeat, and he's cycling these two jobs over and over again until he runs out of materials. If I check inside that workshop, you can now see that he's created all these units of coke from that one unit of bituminous coal. This is a sand, desert, and grassland biome. Desert on the right, grasslands on the left. We have a few trees, but not much. We could cut those for fuel, but I don't have anything to cut them with. So at the moment, we're stuck if we had to depend on that. Because I also got rid of the axe, remember? For the points. Can't cut the trees with no axe. Okay. Now, as soon as he finishes with our bronze, and I do mean as soon as, There he is. Okay, so now he's done that. So now we can work on tools. And the first tools we're going to make are actually axes. Don't really need quite that many. Let's go with 3. Should be enough. We don't have that many trees. I'm hoping we're not attacked while we're still making our axes, so I'm making a few extra in case we need to defend ourselves. But hopefully, he said with his fingers crossed and his hopes up, we'll be able to finish off these axes, cut a few trees, start on picks, and wall this whole thing in before anything bad happens. Remember, we are on a schedule as of right now. The necromancers are coming. And I will make 7 picks because we can get all our dwarves mining at once if we have 7 picks. No picks, no mining. Tools are required for a lot of things dwarves do. This is one example. Now, I could say go designate all these trees for cutting, but there's a problem. Nobody in my fortress currently has the labor assigned to cut trees. In Dwarf Therapist, that's the wood cutting labor here. Nobody is assigned to it. Well, I don't want to have my furnace operator assigned to it because I need him smelting metal. And I don't want to have my weaponsmith assigned to it because I want him making tools. But these other guys, they're all fair game. So we're going to go ahead and put on, oops, not bowery. We're going to put on cutting on these 3 guys. I'm not worried about armor right away, so that's okay. And we'll get these 3 guys making or cutting trees. Now that that labor is enabled, we come back over here to Dwarf Fortress. They will run over, pick up picks, and start cutting any trees I've designated. But I haven't cut any trees. Designated any trees. No. I'm not doing all miners of Fortress, but all of my starting 7 tend to get a little mining when I'm first setting up because it used to be in older versions that the skill of your miner determined how much yield you got from the stone and gems in terms of units. So you would get more stone and more gems with highly skilled miners, and so you'd want to have a couple of really highly skilled miners handling your big stuff, and then you want to have a bunch of non-skilled miners handling your stone excavation, so you don't have as much stone waste to get rid of. Now it's a fixed ratio. You have I think it's 25% chance or something like that to generate a unit of stone or gems or whatever, and it doesn't vary by skill. Doesn't matter how skilled your dwarves are. So now the only determinant of that skill impacts is how fast you can dig. Now, while we do have some folks, thought we had at least, I don't think we have any mining. None of our dwarves have mining to start. They're all dabbling miners. Yes, with an invasion coming, having everybody have mining skill is not a bad thing. If you're using a pick in combat, the mining skill is what determines your ability to use a pick as a weapon. So a highly skilled miner who has been retired from mining and drafted into a specialized military squad provided with armor and equipped with a pick is a really, really bad thing to run into in a dark alley. All the best parts of an axe, all the best parts of a spear, all in one weapon. All right, so we've got our picks started. We need to designate some trees. And there's a little spot will appear on each of these trees, and our guys will run off, grab their axes, and start cutting. Now, it used to be in Dwarf Fortress, 1 tree gave you 1 log. Those days are over. We have multi-tile trees now. And I'll zoom out a little bit here so you can see the benefit of a couple things. So, first off, what you're seeing there are the trees as we zoom down from above, level by level, through them. Remember, think of this like a Minecraft world, and you're zooming level by level down through it. Z level by Z level, block by block, further and further down to ground level, and then below. These trees used to give you one log each, and they used to be one level tall. Now they are multiple levels tall and drop lots and lots of logs. This is both good and bad. Logs can fall on your dwarves. They can be hurt. Dwarves can get stuck up in the trees. I'm not kidding. It does happen. They climb up and then get stuck and forget how to get down. Um, Logs that fall out of trees can punch holes in the ground if your fortress is below them, meaning you can punch a hole in your fort with a tree you just cut. But this amount of wood here should be enough wood to get us a rudimentary fort going. Now, Clinadev's method here would probably be faster. In that, I would simply create a couple of mechanisms, build a support, dig out underneath the wagon, set up a lever, link it to the support, collapse the support, drop the wagon into the hole. Now, all my stuff survives. The wagon doesn't. But we'll be able to build should be able to build, unless they show up in like the first month here, should be able to build a simple hut just large enough for our animals and our dwarves, dig a small staircase and start excavating out underneath it for more space. We just need enough space to move or to cover the wagon and our initial workshops if we want. Everything else can be moved underground very quickly. So you don't need a huge fort to get going. This fort may actually end up inside our later fort. If you're embarking in evil terrain, if you're embarking literally adjacent to the necromancers themselves, you probably don't want to go this route. You probably want to look at dropping the wagon. But since these are constructions, our dwarves will be able to scoop this wood up and deliver it fairly quickly. If you were embarking in an area that was all desert, had no trees to build on, I've never tried dumping it. That's probably safer than dropping the wagon, which is usually why I don't do it. And there's a lot less setup to it. Yeah, I agree. Now that you're describing that, I'm looking at that and going, yeah, that's not a bad idea. Okay, so let's... Why not both, as they say? Por qué no la dos? So we'll get our dwarves building a little wooden hut around our eventual excavation hole here. I like this idea. We will implement this plan immediately. Because this is not the biome I wanted to embark in. Although, to be fair, having the first stream out of the gate and end in ignominious defeat in the first month, that would actually be pretty Dwarf Fortress, wouldn't it? Yeah, but see, the trick is I don't have to dump everything. I can just dump the solid stuff. If I did nothing but dump non-container items, you could dump the meat as long as you don't care it's unbarreled momentarily. You could dump the you don't want to dump the booze. You don't want to dump the sand because I think it empties the containers on both of those, and the items will disappear once you do it. But all your seeds, I mean, if they dump the seed bag, what's the worst that happens? You have separate seeds for a moment. That's not a big deal. And then once it hits the bottom, you just put the stockpile right there once everything's been dumped. We can get a small, tiny little fortress going up here real quick. This isn't a big deal. If you're embarking in evil terrain, all bets are off. You want to get your stuff underground much faster than I already have. We technically don't need that last piece of flooring there. It's only to allow us to cross over if we wanted to while the drawbridge was down. It's not just liquids. There are other things they dump. Maybe? I'm not sure if you dump the barrel whether it leaves the liquid immediately or if it dumps the liquid into the dump. I think you end up with a barrel smashing your prisoner and a puddle of blood. In other words, they're not dumping the blood, they're dumping the container. Does that make sense? They even leave the blood behind. Now, all we've done here is build a small hut. This is nothing. This is the straight up, you build 4 walls, put a ceiling on it, and the ground floor. That's it. Now, this will take a little longer than dumping the stuff down a hole would. Much faster the other way. Should still be fast enough. And once it's done, we don't even care about the ramp. We just want to have a place we can hole up and be done. So, mining. I guess I can do them all. Okay. Let them run. If you dump a container with liquid into it, into a hole with a grate above a test subject, wouldn't the container stay on the grate while the contents go through the grate? I'm fairly certain the answer is no. Because what happens is, when you dump the container with the liquid into it into a hole, it picks the container up and leaves the liquid behind. Not technically speaking dumping the liquid, it just sort of empties it out because you're dumping the container. So he takes the barrel, leaves the blood behind, dumps the barrel into the hole, which falls down onto the grate above the prisoner. The problem isn't that The problem isn't getting the blood out of the barrel at the right time. The problem is that when he goes to dump the barrel, it automatically removes the blood from it. Immediately. On the spot. Like, where it is. It would almost be, if you wanted to perceive it in a way that made more sense, it would be like the dwarf walks up to a barrel full of blood, teleports the barrel into his hands while leaving the blood untouched, and then walks away. The blood immediately falls into a puddle on the floor, and the dwarf walks away with the empty barrel. It's a little weird, but that's kind of how it's work. That's kind of how it works in terms of ticks in the simulation. You follow me? In terms of timing. So we should now be excavating here, guys. I have miners, I have picks. And no, they're all still sitting there. Ooh. That's interesting. I didn't think construction took priority over mining. Oh, they just must not have finished? Surely? Wow. Okay, that's been changed. Unfortunately, Toady hasn't really implemented much with the extracts yet. You know, the bee blood and snake venom. It'd be nice, you know, just as a stopgap, uh, if there was a way for dwarves to use at least the venoms on weapons, for example. And maybe dwarves wouldn't. Maybe you'd only find goblins doing that, and that's one of those additional threats you'll have to deal with, you know. But even if you had to mod them to do it, it would be interesting to have dwarves that could actually envenomate their weapons. I seem to recall that people have made experiments in that direction, but that there's something, and forgive me, I'm not quite speaking out of my posterior, but it's been a long time since I read it. I recall there being experiments to see whether they could make a reaction that would take a sword and some venom and produce a properly envenomated sword, and somebody having trouble getting it to work because there was something broken about the implementation of liquid coatings on. It's been a long time. It's a lot of the stuff under the hood in Dwarf Fortress is workable, but doesn't necessarily provide, you know, good handles if Toady hasn't implemented the feature fully yet. Okay, tell me we've started mining now here, guys. Okay, good. They've actually started mining now. Good. And we've finished up all of our ore. Good, good. And we're going to build ourselves a mechanics workshop here real quick to get ourselves a lever going. Build it with the materials right there on site. And our mechanic is probably one of these guys doing mining, so we're going to have to stop him. Oh, no, he's our smelter. He may still be making some coal upstairs, I suppose. Let's take a look. Yep, he's still making some coal, but we don't need to make any more of that for right now, so we're just going to cancel that and let him get on with something else. Like making that mechanics workshop. See, I'm not worried necessarily about the implementation. Dwarf Fortress is flexible enough that if I want my dwarves to use poison, my dwarves will use poison regardless of what, you know, Toady implements. Once it's implemented, you know, once the keys are given to the player, as it were, it's just like RimWorld. You can modify anything about it you want. You don't have to put it down on day one. You do need to get it down fairly quickly. I'm not so much worried about having one on the surface in this case, but I'm going to put one up in this room. Oh, gotta add our location here. Let's see. We want this to be a temple. And for right now, we're going to give you no specific deed, and you can all just suck it for a moment while we get around this problem. Now, making this a meeting area will draw all the animals down. Once our mechanic has finished up with a handful of mechanisms here, and I only need a couple, I can set up a lever, link it to the bridge, take everything indoors, seal the bridge up, and we're in. We're good. The only thing we haven't brought with us already is the wood that we cut. We didn't need to bring as much as I thought we did. We have a lot more trees than I expected us to. So let's talk about where we're going to do what we're going to do. Let's see. We'll build the main fort right about here. We'll do. So let's go down a level here. Bear with me a second here, guys. Oh, you know what I didn't do? Oh, you know what I didn't do is I didn't show the new guys how the world is laid out underneath. Oh, okay. So let's talk about that for a minute. This next bit is a little cheaty, and I apologize in advance for that. But it's useful to understand, I think, how the stone of Dwarf Fortress maps is laid out, because it will inform your decision on how you mine for ore and stone almost immediately once you understand what you're looking at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the fog of war in the stone here for a minute and talk about how ores are laid out in minerals, veins, and clusters, how gem clusters are laid out, and so forth. All right, so this is a fair... So we've got our surface level up here at the top, right? We've got a level of soil below that, and then it looks like 2 levels of soil below that, and this is stone. And I can tell that because this tile set changes from no veins of and no inclusions here, really. You can sometimes have inclusions in soil, but it's rare. This is mineral. These are mineral veins. This is different minerals. I don't know what the yellow is. It's probably limonite, but I'd have to look. It could be gold. This could be cassiterite or tetrahedrite. I'm not sure. I haven't memorized Vettlinger's tile set yet. We can look at it in a minute. These smaller whitish and blackish clusters that you see periodically are different types of gems. So here's my dwarves in their room, surrounded by these veins of minerals in the soil around them. Now I'm hoping... don't see any clusters, really. Just looks like... here's one, but it's kind of hidden there. Looks like this... here we go. These are large mineral clusters. So in addition to veins of minerals like this, you can see clusters that are like this. Now, if I zoom way out, what you're going to notice is there's a pattern to this. You notice how there are effectively 4 segments across and 4 segments tall on the map. And each segment gets a cluster and a vein roll, if you will, kind of. See, so there's a cluster here, a cluster there with some veins, a cluster here with some veins, and there are 16 different blocks on the map. Since I embarked in a 4x4 embark, that's how my map is laid out underneath. If you embark in a 3x3, the only difference is that your map would be trimmed right here along the edges of that segment. And you'd end up with 3 clusters across by 3 clusters tall with veins interleaved. And this goes all the way down. It's worth noting, all the way down, all the way down. And some stone, now this stone here, we've changed out. We no longer have veins over here on the right. Whatever this stone is, we've lost them. Still some more. These are probably cobaltite, maybe. It's blue. It's nothing valuable. And here's a cavern coming up. So you can see some open rooms with some trees and some labyrinthine, passages as well, mixed together. Then on down past that cave into some more stone. And another cave comes up. And then past that cave down into another. And it looks like there's a chasm here. See this? So this cave actually links up all the way down to the next cave. Okay. Now these black boxes here I'll get to in a moment. That's the spoiler stuff. We'll get to that in a sec. And on down. It's a deep world. Okay. And here's where we start to encounter the magma sea. Here's some semi-molten rock coming up. And then at the very bottom, we'll have the pits. Okay, so the black boxes here are hiding the adamantine from me because there could be demons in those little tubes. So I don't need to see where they are. I don't really care. The whole point is just to show you how this is laid out. The intent being, if you're a new player and you're wanting to lay your fortress out a certain way, and you don't really care that you're looking ahead, as it were, revealing the map allows you to easily and quickly determine where things are underground to lay them out so you don't run into things. Now, I don't recommend playing this way. For one thing, it eliminates certain discoveries that you can make. It can interfere with your discovery of the caverns, which has an impact on your farming later. And it's a little cheaty. But I think understanding how Dwarf Fortress lays out its embarks in these blocks helps you understand how to mine for ores down the road. If you know where you are within your embark, roughly speaking, which block you're in, then you know where to dig to find the next block of minerals or the next collection of veins of minerals. You won't necessarily hit everything, but you'll minimize the amount of tunnels you have to make. And that comes back to bear on pathfinding. The more things you have in the map, the further they're trying to move, the further they're trying to go, That's interesting. Oh, that's our... never mind. That's our designation. I'm zoomed so far out I couldn't tell what I was looking at. I got distracted by my oddity there. Once you're playing, I think it's better to play with the Fog of War on as you normally would. I just think it's useful for a new player to cut down on their mining around to find more minerals. Since longer mine tunnels mean more pathfinding, and more dwarves and more pathfinding is a recipe for your fortress to grind to a halt, it's better if you have less mining and find the minerals quickly, not from a balance perspective, but simply from a keeping your fortress alive and viable long-term perspective. I turn reveal back off, and once more the Fog of War is restored. I hope you all memorized it, because I know I didn't. So, let's zoom back in on what we were doing. Got distracted by all that talk about dumping fluids, and I forgot about the actual fortress. Okay, so that'll be our first floor we'll have, and that should still be... If this were stone when I excavated it, I would actually go up one more floor and dig out some soil. It's useful to have soil if you're planning to farm. So let's digress a moment into farming even before we're ready for it here. Let's get these guys moving first, and then we'll go on to that. So let's do there. Okay, this is deep enough. And we'll just connect them up with a stairway we want. Now, the way I'm going to design the fortress, traffic designations help, but they're still pathfinding. You can cut down on it, but you can only minimize it. You can't eliminate it. Building your fortress in a small, horizontal, highly vertical area helps. There's less branching out for the pathfinding to do. Unfortunately, not mining is the primary one. Walling up old tunnels, I believe, helps once you've severed them. They're no longer accessible under any circumstances. Dwarves won't try to pathfind through the walls. Okay, so we still don't have any beds up. We need to get some temporary beds. We don't have any beds. Let's get that fixed. Build, workshop, carpenter. This is one area where I kind of frown at Clinadev's build. I do like having a carpenter for high quality beds, since a bed is the one piece of furniture every dwarf is pretty much guaranteed to own. Having a high quality collection of them, because you have a highly skilled carpenter, allows you to guarantee that every dwarf has at least one happy observed of furniture thought. Theoretically, photo number, the ideal fortress layout would be some sort of spheroid, right? I mean, spherical or close to it. In terms of raw pathfinding on 3D, unless Toadie's done something very strange with how he's implemented pathfinding, and assuming all of the directions are equivalently weighted, X, Y, and Z, then spherical would be ideal. But since dwarves can't fly, you're forced to put in flooring, and that cuts your sphere into a stack of pancakes, no matter how you do it. It's just a question of whether you want, your pancakes all shaped the same size or not. So typically what I would end up with is I would dig out what I would call a pancake stack. It's like a stack of silver dollar pancakes from top to bottom, like a skyscraper built underground. Basements or a parking garage where every floor is one above another, right? Cylindrical would be a theoretical ideal, because you would. So, Jesus, it's almost 10 o'clock. So, we're almost done for this evening, guys, because I'm only going to do this for 3 hours a night tonight. And only 2 tomorrow because I got something planned, I'm afraid. But we'll make it up on Saturday. 3:05. So we're not due for migrants for another month yet. I was hoping I'd get migrants before the end of this. Let me make a note to myself here so I don't forget that I've got a migrant to name. I don't usually have a migrant with high skill in carpentry. I might get one with a skill of 2 or 3 sometimes if I'm lucky, but rarely do I get someone who starts with a 5 or better as a carpenter who shows up when and as I need them. You could theoretically maybe make an argument for dropping fluid engineer and picking up carpentry on that one dwarf. Well, sadly, photo number, you're correct. It is limiting aesthetically. The pancake stack design is efficient, but not particularly sexy. If you're wanting to build fascinating temple spaces, what typically ends up happening for me is my main fortress is in a pancake stack, and then there's certain buildings like temples and taverns are then built as like wings off that. So it almost ends up being almost like a space station sort of look. Round rooms linked to more round rooms sticking off the sides. If you want something pretty and you want to keep your pathfinding low, traffic designations are about as good as you're going to get, since that forces, especially if you maybe kick the weights up a little bit. Instead of 1, 2, 5, maybe you go 1, 3, 9. Um, you can force their pathfinding down much more rigid uh, paths, which will help, but you're still going to limit it. Well, we're going to get to test your theory. I'm not sure. You say it's weighted to give you critical skill migrants. Still sounds like waiting to determine whether the first caravan's going to have an anvil. I won't say that I've never had a high skill carpenter arrive, but I'm not sure I've had it happen early enough that I would depend on it. You could make an argument for using these as tavern beds. After all, you don't really care too much about the quality of your tavern rooms beyond a certain point, and you can always put more furniture in there. You could make an argument for hospital beds if you need one early. Again, same thing. You're more worried about having a bed than you are about how high quality it is. So before I forget, let me get carpentry set on one of my guys here. Let's do it on our furnace operator. I think he's also our mechanic, isn't he? Yeah, he's also our mechanic. So a few mechanisms is about all we're going to get out of him otherwise. So we'll get him doing some carpentry on the side. And we're not going to quick train him, but we are going to get some beds up out of him. See, and that's actually not a bad idea. I don't intend to leave this long, narrow tunnel long term. I don't intend to have access all the time from that area to this area. I won't be using it normally, and I don't see a use for it. So I wish I'd dug it a little closer to where my main fortress would be. I kind of wish I had. That's interesting. If he's confirmed it, that's good. It's nice that I could then theoretically depend on it. I'd be curious what the list, do you know off the top of your head what the list of critical professions that the game will preferentially send you is? All right, they got our room. Good, good, good. Okay. So let's take a look at what we're dealing with in terms of terrain. Is this soil or sand? This is white sand. So this is a good spot for farms. We'll abuse a trick that the DF hack guys really wish I wouldn't. I do need to remember to bind that to a hotkey at some point, but I never do. Okay, now I have designated all these floors to have their space dug, but I have not actually connected them up. So the dwarves won't actually dig all of them out at once yet. We're just wanting them to do this, kind of one floor at a time. The problem with the pancake stack design in terms of logistics is um, the problem you're going to run into with pancake stack logistics is when you're first mining it out, the dwarves treat areas that are above one another as being in the same tile normally, when they shouldn't in some cases. For example, they're not really considering the floor between this floor and the floor below it when they do their pathfinding. So they'll do a lot of mine a tile on the top floor, go to the stairs, go down a floor, go back under, mine a floor tile there, go back to the stairs, go up a floor, go back to where you were, mine a tile over there, go back to the stairs, go down, mine a tile below that one, over and over and over again. That extra pathfinding adds up really quick. If you're mining out 6 or 7 floors at a time, your dwarves are pathfinding back and forth a lot, and they're not doing as much mining out. So be cautious if you don't have a large number of miners in designating large sections of your pancake stack to be dug out at once. So you guys got me monologuing, and I almost forgot to build the damn lever. And if I leave it till next time, I will forget, so we're definitely going to do that now. Didn't realize he was already done. I'm waiting on him to get finished. My hut is so small, they're not wandering away from their jobs when they're done. Now, what I've done here is I built those 4 walls and a ceiling, and I left this hole here with a bridge. And this bridge is a raising bridge, not a retracting bridge, if I've done this correctly. And it will close like a wall. So at this point, we are now sealed in. Nothing can get to us. We are completely impervious to all outside assault. Congratulations, you've now won Dwarf Fortress. The end. I'm only partly kidding. Theoretically, if you want, you can, in fact, burrow yourself into the ground, seal yourself up, ignore all migrants, and allow your starting 7 to repopulate the Earth. You could open yourself up occasionally and maybe airlock the migrants in, put them in quarantine in case any of them turn out to be vampires or werewolves. And as long as you were careful with who you admitted and you didn't accidentally make any vampire and werewolf mistakes, you could probably keep your dwarves underground for a really long time with no contact with the outside world. It'd probably get boring eventually, but you could do it. Taverns. So this is about where I'm going to leave off for the night. So let's discuss that for a moment. Taverns. Where am I going to put my tavern? What am I going to do with the tavern? So eventually, at some point, we will have our little pancake stack here, right? And we will build a surface fortress up here. I will stick the depot in it, because getting our dwarves to haul stuff to the trade depot is a convenient way to occasionally expose them to sunlight. Drag them across the surface, throw them into the sunlight, force them to vomit green everywhere. Quarantining. Okay, so if you want to quarantine your dwarves, you effectively have to build a small sub-fortress capable of handling your migrant waves, and a main fortress where your dwarves will live once they have finished their quarantine. Now, this outer fortress doesn't have to be particularly exotic. It could be a room with some beds and tables that you chuck food into from above. But it has to be separate from your main fortress, and there cannot be overlap. because what you're trying to avoid is the dwarf you let in is in the middle of your dining room when he decides that today is the full moon and now is a really good time to become a were elephant. At which point he splatters your entire fortress all over the inside of the cavern. The end. You don't want that. Vampires, next thing you let them in, next thing you know, they're sucking your legendary weaponsmith dry. The only way you can filter them out is no. Remember, you're talking about quarantine. You asked me about quarantine. The answer is basically you stick a bunch of dwarves in a box, make sure they've got food, and keep them there for at least a month. A month gives the werebeasts time to go back, and if any of them are vampires, you'll know it because they'll start eating each other. If you don't want to sacrifice your migrants to each other and you want to quarantine them, then you have to get really crazy and do individual quarantine cells. Have fun with that. Looking at that list of skills, most of them aren't bad, but there's a few that I would just clearly raise my eyebrow and go, who cares? That's not... If it's all the skills in the Play Now list, I look down through here and Weaver's not great, but it's not terrible. Fisher Dwarf is okay, yeah, all right. Fish Cleaner? Ew. Waste. Potash Maker? Lye Maker? Oof. It's a broad list of skills to consider critical, I guess. Individual quarantine is something I would never even attempt. Realistically, I rarely quarantine at all, unless I have a really long-term fortress that I am absolutely adamant about maintaining above all. You have to build all those structures. You have to think about it. You have to have enough beds for all the dwarves who are going to stay there. You have to have enough food and drink separate out for them. No, I don't always get them. Sometimes somebody will get in. I get vampires occasionally slip in. Vampires are a lot harder to keep out. They're not always innately obvious. I'm wearing 5 pounds of human bone jewelry. I'm 100 and... So, wait. Back up a step, Clinadev. That's like completely contradictory. I mean, look at that for a moment. It looks at a list of skills currently represented, weighted towards the ones you don't have. Okay? But if you've used it a lot, you'll also get more of those. So, don't have it or have a lot of it, and you get more of it. Where's Mr. Miyagi when we need him? Walk down left side of road. Safe. Walk down right side of road. Safe. Walk down middle of road. Just like Lye Maker. Which means if I set up an early fishing industry, I'm guaranteed to get lots and lots of fishermen. It might not be in the first wave photo number, but what that's basically saying is if you have a big wave of animal caretakers, then future waves will also include more animal caretakers. That seems really bad. It kind of makes sense though from a realism standpoint. So back up a moment and consider this from a back out of the game mode for a moment and think about it. And it does make some sense because what happens when in a world like Dwarf Fortress a trade master sets himself up as a craftsman? Here's this guy cranking out the world's best stone statues. What happens? People come to him and want to be apprenticed. They're not necessarily world-class sculptors themselves, but they want to be. So they come to learn, right? So it kind of makes sense from that standpoint. I mean, yeah, a little. I'm not sure it should necessarily apply unless we're dealing with high-skilled. But again, if you've used it a lot, that's usually going to be high skill. So, I mean, I think on balance it works. It's just one of those things where I kind of scratch my head and go, I'd rather know that I can depend on it to give me a carpenter when I don't have one, or that I should never depend it on it to send me a carpenter when I don't have one. All right, so let me save the game, guys, because it's 10:30 or 10:15 or so, and I only promised to do this for 3 hours a night. Come on, guys, gotta breathe and sleep. It's going to become a common topic. Although, to be fair, I don't expel vampires if I catch them. I have a raising drawbridge. I have a militia group. That's all I'm saying. Well, you see, it's not so much that I necessarily need to sleep for tonight. It's that after tomorrow's stream, I've got things planned, and, well, I'd like to be well rested. Animal Caretaker report to Spear Squad 4. Frontline infantry! Frontline infantry! Frontline infantry! You can. There are uses for them. I've seen people who put them in the well and get all their, make a vampire fort. You could, build a sub fort. Remember that quarantine example, right? Any quarantine example allows you to also safely contain a vampire. If you put them in their own militia squad, train them relentlessly, quarantine them up, they can't get to any but the dwarves, right? The problem is, of course, the moment you let them out, they leave your control. Vampires are not guaranteed to respond to orders you give them. So they may decide, hey, I want to go back into the fort and munch a dwarf if you leave them the way to do so. If you don't ever expose them to an opportunity to munch on your legendary weaponsmith, then I'd say there's probably some uses. You could do that. And then the legendary weaponsmith shows up and goes, hey, I sent my 3 brothers to your fortress before, and now they're not here. What happened to them? And you're forced to tell that legendary weaponsmith, who's been missing his brothers for who knows how long, that you've all turned them all into vampire fodder. And in the current version, I'm not sure you want to be explaining that. Stress, etc., etc. Although, to be fair, I'm not sure how Dwarf Fortress actually handles my relatives died off camera to a vampire and nobody knows how. I know it used to be the case that if you bridge smashed someone with no witnesses, there was no report of the death. But no, if I discern I have a vampire or a werebeast, it's very simple. It's off to the bridge with you. The problem with making them all vamps is they get slower if they don't drink blood. They slow down over time. Slower and slower and slower until they're crawling. You don't want your legendary weaponsmith taking 3 days to get to the forge. So you're then tied, but you're torn between, do I give him an occasional migrant and look the other way? You could. Like I said, put the vampire in quarantine by himself, right? So he can't get any of your dwarves if you don't want him to. And then when you bring new dwarves in, he's gonna pick. If you've got beds there, he's just one of them's gonna bed down with the vampire. That's the end of it. Let fate choose. But no, generally speaking, I'm playing it straight with my dwarves, if you will. I don't promise to treat them like kings, but I do tend to try and keep them free of vampires and werebeast infection. Especially werebeast infection. Doubly especially werebeast infection. Hey, Clinidev, what's the common holding on how you deal with werebeast tavern visitors? That's one I'm going to have to spend some time thinking about. Only kind of. You can set up, and I will set up in our fortress a what I would call a public library and a private library. Our temples are going to be are going to be residents only. Our so visitors have no reason to come into the fortress proper except for the tavern. The tavern is one place I really don't have a good way to lock things down. If I want my dwarves to interact with outsiders, then I have to have a mixed use tavern. Otherwise, the only time they see outsiders is when we trade. Now, that's very Tolkien esque of my dwarves, but not particularly dwarf fortressy of them. And once you start exposing the tavern outsiders to your dwarves, you start to run the risk of tavern visitor is in the tavern when he becomes a werebeast and slaughters everyone. Now, I will have the tavern outside a layer of defense. Oh, great. Necromancer's in the tavern? You're kidding me, right? Lovely, lovely. Well, I guess we'll see if our necromancer give. Maybe we can make peace with the local necromancers. Come try our dwarven ale. Bring your zombie friend. Actually, I was going to ask if there was anybody I should be hosting, while I'm offline, because the reality is I don't stream very often. It was inevitable, Clinidev. It was inevitable. To be honest, I'd have to figure out how to set it up so that. Holy hell, I don't even know that I've ever actually done a raid on this thing. There you go, guys. Have fun.